22-97. Relative to response to procurement, I'd like to call upon Delegation Dion Melikoff. Dion Melikoff. Don't think I'm butchering that too badly. Okay. Moving on, I would call upon a Delegation Deanna Ogle. Good afternoon, Deanna Ogle. I'll ask that you please introduce yourself for the record, the organization you're representing, and what city or town you reside in. You'll have 5 minutes to address City Council, after which time you'll have the opportunity to answer questions from Council. Good afternoon.
Okay, great, thank you. So thanks for having me. My name is Deanna Ogle, and I'm the Regional Director for Prairies in the North for the Canadian Labour Congress, and I live in Regina. So, like many of the 1 in 5 children in Saskatchewan who currently live in poverty, and the 106,000 children who live in poverty and whose parents engage in some level of paid work, I grew up in a household where both my parents worked more than full-time hours to make ends meet. What changed for my family, and what changes for so many families, is that my mother was able to secure a full-time union job with benefits. It was transformative. The transformative nature of work that allows ones to make ends meet, to take care of themselves and their families, is what led to my work with the BC-based Living Wage for Families campaign as an organizer. In my time with the Living Wage for Families campaign, I supported 10 local governments, including the City of Vancouver, and over 60 companies to transform their procurement practices to prioritize fair wages and local businesses. To be clear, a living wage policy is different than what is being proposed here, and I'll be speaking about fair wage policies only. The staff report that you have in front of you really clearly articulates that difference, so I'm not going to elaborate on that in a great deal of detail. A fair wage policy is a good start to thinking about how procurement is tied to the overall values and work of the city. Procurement, as much as community grants, is an expression of the community that we want to create. It's not separate from the overall expression of community goals that we engage with in civic governance. So this is really reflected in the report in front of you, as well as the goals and efforts of the City of Regina procurement team. So it also really articulates a lot of who already has fair wage policies, the City of Toronto and Burnaby being the two, I think, highest profile examples of fair wage policies. The report also identifies that the City of Toronto has had a fair wage policy since 1893. This is a very well-worn path that the City of Regina would walk down. And much of the policy and implementation work has been done by other municipalities. You're not reinventing the wheel. This wheel has been run and operating literally since the 1800s. So there, of course, would be the need to tweak any incoming policy to meet local conditions, but this is well within the framework of other procurement policies being considered, like the sustainability policy and Indigenous-focused procurement. Fair wage policies are normally very broad when they're passed, and then you allow staff the leverage and the ability to really tweak the details. So, like, what exactly is a fair wage? You don't want that in the motion itself because that's going to shift over time. That's the details that staff work out, and that's the expertise that staff bring to the table. The key to implementation is a clear set of guidelines that takes into account thresholding, prioritizing the bulk of construction spending, as well as shifting the relationship with suppliers. So in my time working with Van City, the City of Vancouver, Port Coquitlam, many other cities, what procurement teams talked about was the need to move from across the table conversations with suppliers to same side of the table conversation with suppliers. So this includes information sessions, which your procurement team already identifies in the report that they're going to be doing as part of several other procurement practices. So well within the bulk of what they're actually able to accomplish and already planning for as part of the efficiency review process and some of the other processes that are coming forward. It's a supportive conversation that ensures contractors clearly understand the requirements and are able to demonstrate the ability to meet them. So in fact, Van City in their move to a living wage policy was able, through advancing these processes across their procurement and not just in construction, were able to offset the costs of advancing a living wage policy through sharpening their pencils and tightening a lot of the other contracts that had just over time bloated or grown in size or no longer met the need but were being automatically renewed. So exactly what you're tackling through your efficiency process. What we found in terms of supplier side in implementation is that aside from initial fears, that suppliers were actually relieved once the process went through, because these information sessions and some of the implementation practices were able to ensure that they didn't have to worry about underbidding on wage issues, that they were able to focus on what they felt was the value add that their particular company brought to the table. So suppliers, especially smaller suppliers and local companies, felt more comfortable entering into the RFP process after the information sessions once there was clarity around the requirements, and were much more comfortable with the RFP process as a whole, that there was a place for them to ask questions, enter into a conversation. It built trust.
Ms. Ogle, you've surpassed 5 minutes, so if you could wrap it up in
Okay,
about the next
sorry.
15 seconds.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for giving me time to wrap up. And so to wrap up, I'm just going to quickly walk through apprenticeship, the value of apprenticeship in addressing it, and how that works with fair wage processes. So apprentices provide a clear and defined path for folks to engage in a fulfilling career. We know that there's equity issues when it comes to women and Indigenous folks entering into apprenticeships. They have a harder time getting employment. Fair wage policies allow for to address some of the pre-existing gender wage gaps in the trades, which is estimated at about 47%. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Members of council for questions. Councillor Stevens.
Thank you. Through the chair. You have experience with these policies. Some of the delegates suggest that this will kill small businesses, hurt small businesses, prevent them from bidding on contracts. Is there truth to that?
Not in my experience. In my experience, especially working with living wage policies, they were much more expansive than the policy that you're talking about here. That the process of implementation meant that it actually helped small businesses enter into some of these conversations, because some of the info sessions, some of the education meant that they felt more confident actually bidding, especially smaller businesses where you have a side-by-side relationship where business owners are working directly with workers. They want to make sure that their workers are doing well.
Okay, thank you. Second question, you've mentioned Van City, which is a credit union. I think it's Canada's largest credit union. So a private sector organization adopted a similar policy. How has that worked out for them, if you could provide some more details?
Yeah, so I worked with several large private sector organizations that adopted living wage policies. Van City being the largest, is Canada's largest credit union, and a procurement spend in the millions of dollars a year. And so it worked well. They were actually able to move a lot faster and more nimbler. They are private sector as opposed to public sector, which has a different accountability structure because you're dealing with the public money. Of course, that's good and right. But what they found is that the skill set around implementing fair wage policies or procurement policies really allowed them to advance their procurement across the board. So it didn't, it's not like you just sit and keep that skill set in that particular area. Those teams were able to implement it across the board, and it was overwhelmingly something that they felt positively about.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stevens. Councillor Stadnicek.
Thank you. Through the chair, I wanted to ask you, one of the things that we've also heard at Executive Committee was that it would be an unnecessary administrative burden to have a fair wage policy. With your familiarity with any of these policies, does it create an additional layer of administration or bureaucracy?
At no point in the implementation of these policies did any of these businesses or municipal governments need to add on staff in order to implement it. Some chose to add on staff as part of other procurement policies that they were enacting at the same time, such as I think there's one staff person being added to the City of Regina. I think there's a request to deal with some of the other procurement policies around environmental and sustainability goals. but at no point was there an additional administrative burden placed upon a procurement team because of this. It was often something that the procurement team itself was very proud of because it was a way for them to showcase the skills and the values that they brought to their work. And it was a way for them to articulate how they worked within the value structure of the organization.
Through you, Mayor Masters, a follow-up, I was actually referring to the companies. There was a feeling from some of the representatives from different companies that it would put an administrative burden on them when they are bidding on projects, because they'd have to show the wage schedules or whatever that process would be for the fair wage policy.
Yeah, okay. I think, what we saw, again, coming into it, that many companies felt afraid about, what does this mean and how does this impact processes that we already engage in. But really what it meant often was a clarification of an RFP process, that through the process, they were already engaged in administrative work to submit an RFP. And so it was really just a tweaking of that process rather than an undue burden or an additional level of work that was placed upon it. They're already doing RFP work, and that is already significant for companies in order to engage in.
Thank you. Through the Mayor, I think this is my last question. Just to, another comment at Executive Committee was that the majority of construction companies that bid on jobs in Regina already are paying very high wages. So why should we have this a fair wage policy if we're already paying very high wages? So what would be from your point of view, what would be the importance of having a fair wage policy if wages are already pretty high?
Yeah, so fair wage policies aren't designed to, to impact like a red seal electrician, for example. They're already doing okay. Where a fair wage policy helps and assists is in first-year apprentice. Right, and the wage gaps we see as people enter into some of these trades, and what helps them stay in that trade and move forward. Right, we know that apprentices struggle. We know that apprentices take significant risks, especially when we're talking about equity groups like Indigenous folks or women who typically enter into trades at an older age. And so, they may be a single parent, and so having a good first-year apprentice wage means that they're able to move forward and become that red seal technician and earn those higher wages and sustain their families in a meaningful way. So fair wage policies, for the most part, aren't going to impact the bulk of people, but what they will do is encourage sustainable entry points into work for younger folks in this industry. And that's something that's really key as we see large gaps in who is entering into these sectors and I think admittedly many of these sectors are saying that they're having a hard time finding workers.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Stadnicek. Councillor Bresciani.
Thank you very much. Can you tell me Canadian Labour Congress? What is that? Just a whole bunch of unions? Well, tell me what that is. I don't know.
Okay,
I've never heard that.
so specifically the Canadian Labour Congress is the overarching Canadian body for affiliated unions, federations of labour, as well as labour councils. So we act as a central labour body across Canada. I work specifically within the Prairie region, so Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta.
And do you reside in Regina?
I live in Regina. I live in Elritchie.
Okay, thank you. So, we hear from, the union side, and then we hear from the business side, right, trying to, look at the whole possible solution. And, from businesses that, I speak with, does it, for smaller companies, right, that are looking at hiring maybe Indigenous or lower skilled workers, right? Again, is this something though that could cut them out?
Absolutely not. And I think what it does is it creates a level playing field. And what we found, especially with living wage policies or fair wage policies, is that small businesses often want to do the right thing. They're working side by side with those workers. And what the barrier is often is that then they're coming up against these larger businesses that maybe have the ability, or are paying lower wages than they already may be. And so then that puts them at a disadvantage when it comes to bidding for city contracts. What a fair wage policy does is creates a level playing field. It says, here's the starting point. Then it's what else do you add as a business? What else do you bring and what is your value? And so, I would say that for it actually helps smaller business who often actually pay very adequate wages and are really trying to not just do the right thing because it's their passion, but they're embedded in the community. They are the community.
Thank you. I guess my second point, though, is as a small business owner, sometimes you can only pay what you can afford.
Yeah.
So my point is, sometimes businesses cannot pay what a union would pay. A union, and it's similar to the city of Regina. When you look at private industry, you can look at both ways,
Yeah.
depending on. So again, my point is, if it becomes a checklist or a point where if you are, paying a living wage or however you want to, and what is deemed, my point is, we've heard we're already paying a living wage. Many
Right.
are already paying. So what would be the reason we would need to, and I think you answered that to
Yeah, I
Councillor.
did, yeah.
But I think the worry is the fact that once it becomes painted on there, that's going to be the thing that you have to pay. You have to pay this living wage of whatever it is.
Yeah, and all of the contracts would be coming in at that rate, and so that would allow this business owner to pay at that rate. Like,
And so
I
the
think
ones-
it's up to them to build in a bid competitively that meets the requirements. That's the RFP process itself. And so it's up to them in that bidding process to ensure that they're bidding at a rate that allows them to pay that wage.
So a smaller company, back to my point, a smaller company that cannot pay those wages would not be able to apply on a city, on an RFP. Is that accurate?
No, that's not at all accurate. In fact, that I would say that a smaller company should actually integrate that into their costing and their bidding. And then once they achieve that, when they're acting or enacting that contract, they pay at the rate they said they would.
Thank you. So do you ever go outside and talk to small business?
Yes.
You do?
Yeah.
And in the fact that some smaller companies may not be able to pay as much as, and certain times, right? So when it's going good or when it's slower, obviously you're going to look at your bottom line and you're going to say, I can pay this wage, I can bring on more, or depending on, what how they're operating. But my point is, and I think I'm just, for clarity, you're saying that you do not believe that it would isolate any kind of contractor that comes forward that cannot pay those wages, it would not affect them.
I'm saying that it's up to each business to meet the requirements of the RFP process and integrate that into their business practices. Outside of what they do outside of a fair wage policy, of course, is independent and unique to each business and is not something I can speak to in the realm of the motion before you.
Thank
Any
you, that's all I
further-
have.
Thanks, Councillor Berciano. Councillor Mancinelli.
Thank you. So when looking at this fair wage or living wage policy, is there any natural advantage to a place like Regina to perform well under this circumstance compared to other places across the country, big cities, capital cities? Is there a formula that favors us for how we have our quality of life here?
I think, one of the values that I find, especially in Prairie City, is, and one of the values I find in Saskatchewan, I grew up in Saskatchewan, is the value of hard work. That we believe that if you get up and you go to work, that you should be able to support your family. And I think that's a value that holds across the political spectrum. That's not something that I think, falls in any of the political playing cards that we like to shuffle around. And so I think the value of that is the city saying, that is something we recognize that the citizens of this city value, and here's how we're going to reflect that back at you. And here's how we reflect that value back at you. We reflect that value by saying, we're going to integrate it into our procurement practices, for example. And in this case, what a fair wage policy would do would be place the city of Regina as a leader in this area in Saskatchewan. And I think that's something that's really bold. And I think it's something that the city should be proud of, because that is, I think, a value that we all hold.
When talking to industry about this in the last little bit here, I've been defining the fair wage as a living wage because that's the last set of actual numbers I've received from administration that were quantified. Of all the people I spoke to, and some of them representing a lot of industry, none of them had any question whether or not they were being paid over and above that amount already by far. Does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't surprise me. And I think, and I think it speaks to, again, the work that we do in our communities and how this is something that isn't necessarily partisan in the approach that we take. So it doesn't surprise me that industry is meeting this standard. I think that's great. And then let's celebrate that we meet that standard. Then it would be even reduce the administrative burden of a business applying for an RFP under this, because they're already meeting that standard. And it allows them the ability to, and the format to say, hey, this is what we contribute to the community. Above and beyond the work that we do, we contribute to the community in terms of supplying meaningful jobs. And those meaningful jobs exist, and those people then feed into the economy. It's a way to celebrate and talk about, this specific aspect.
Thank you. In your presentation, you mentioned something about not being able to bid if you're not a fair wage employer under this policy. I just wanted to correct that if I couldn't, make sure that I'm correct. You've been in this a lot more than I have. If we decide to go down this road and make policy, there's nothing that says that we have to make it binary in decision. We could decide to take this value and say that it's an important value in our community, and when we're weighting our proposals, we could just give a little bit of extra weight to someone who's operating in a proper circumstance to their employees without ruling anyone out in a small labor market like ours. Because of your comments, I just want to clarify that and see if you agree with that.
Yeah, how you enact it, again, this is why I mentioned local tweaking, right? So how you enact it is based on you as council kind of setting direction and staff coming back with the direction. In terms of not being able to bid, is solely in relation to comments that small businesses should not bid or could not bid if they didn't meet the wage. What I'm saying is that it's the RFP process, and understanding that this is the kind of the floor that we're under. It allows contractors to articulate one of the values that they hold.
Labor's in your name. Just to make sure that I understand, I often find small businesses pay quite well.
Yeah.
I just wonder if that's been your understanding or your experience as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely been my experience. And the experience I'm speaking of, to be clear, wasn't within the Canadian Labour Congress. This is a standalone community organization in BC that I worked for. It was prior to joining I was prior to working for the labor movement. But my experience at that time, the vast majority of living wage employers were small businesses.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mancinelli. I see no further questions from council. Well, thank you very much for your presentation this afternoon. Ask you to return to the gallery. Call upon Delegation Laurie Jobe. I'll ask that you please state your name for the record, the organization you're representing, and where you reside. You'll have 5 minutes to present to council, after which time you'll have the opportunity to answer any questions. Welcome.
Thank you. My name is Laurie Jobe, and I'm president of the Saskatchewan Federation of Labor. We represent nearly 100,000 workers from every corner of the province, from 37 affiliated national and international unions. Our office is in Regina, based in Regina. I work out of Regina. I reside in Leroy, Saskatchewan. There are a few main areas that I would like to focus on that I believe would be of great benefit to the working people in the city of Regina. The first being the issue of apprenticeships. Our trade union affiliates are constantly being told of a shortage of skilled workers. Requiring all contractors on the City of Regina projects to use the apprenticeship system would ensure that the city is using trained, skilled workers and giving them the credentials they need to advance through technical training, and using employers that are part of the apprenticeship system would go a long ways towards in helping alleviate a shortage of skilled workers, and the Saskatchewan Federation of Labor and our affiliates are strongly in favor of this. Additionally, requiring all contracts to use the apprenticeship system would ensure safer workplaces. By making apprenticeship mandatory, the city is ensuring that they have competent workers and supervision on their projects. This protects the workers from serious injury and death, but it also insulates the city from liability in the event of a worker does fall victim to a workplace accident. In terms of the city's Indigenous procurement policy, I would simply remind the City Council that the city has committed to the TRC's calls to action, specifically the call to action number 92, which calls on the corporate sector to ensure that Indigenous peoples have equitable access to jobs, training, and education opportunities in the corporate sector, and that Indigenous communities gain long-term sustainable benefits from the economic development projects. As has been noted, the economic impact of Indigenous procurement policies is of great benefit to the city and the local Indigenous communities that would foster these opportunities for increased apprenticeships, work experience, and careers in the trades. Requiring contractors to use the apprenticeships, that would mean that all Indigenous workers who are employed by the City of Regina construction projects would be indentured as apprentices. This would prevent a contractor from hiring Indigenous workers merely to check a box. Lastly, I strongly recommend that the city move forward on implementing a fair wage policy. There are many misconceptions about fair wage policies, mainly that they drive up the cost of construction. However, research has shown us that this simply is not the case. While the cost of construction projects have gone up over the past 5 years, wages have not. We still have about 25% inflation in prices over that time. And it's not just the issues of prices going up to wages, it's that wages are not catching up to the prices. A fair wage policy would ensure that a winning bidder on a project is the one with the best plan and would deliver the best quality of work and be the most efficient and productive and most likely the most safe. So thank you again for this opportunity to speak to council today. I know that there are many projects the city is moving forward on, and implementing these changes to the city's procurement policies would be a great benefit to the working people who build the infrastructure that we all rely on and who drive up the economy of this city. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Job. I'll open it up to any members of council who have questions. Seeing none, I'll thank you very
Great.
much for your presentation this afternoon and ask you to return to the gallery.
Thank you.
I call upon Delegation Mark Cooper. I'll ask you to please introduce yourself for the record, the organization you're representing, and where you happen to live. You'll have 5 minutes to address City Council, after which you'll have the opportunity to answer questions. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Your Worship. So my name is Mark Cooper. I represent the Saskatchewan Construction Association and its many construction employers. I live here in Regina. So thanks again for the opportunity to speak to Council. I am, as I mentioned here today, on behalf of the Saskatchewan Construction Association and our members to specifically speak to Council's proposal to pursue the fair wage policy. Our position on this issue, I think, is well understood from the opportunity we had to speak last week, so I'm going to try and bring a few different perspectives based on what I've been hearing in the last week or so in conversation. So let me again unequivocally state that our industry supports the core objectives that have been expressed by Council's motion, and that we really fully support the recommendations that were advanced by administration. We do not, however, support the introduction of a fair wage policy. We want to see infrastructure work, as much of that as possible, go to local companies and be done by local workers. We want those local workers to be well paid and have a high quality of life and to be safe. We want that workforce to be representative of our community, and we want our work and our community to be sustainable in every sense of the word. But the claims that we have heard from those in favor of fair wage, let me address some of those. So one is that this isn't really just about construction, but perhaps more targeted to those businesses where low wages are in fact a problem, and especially when, the city is considering potentially outsourcing some work that would previously have been done by own forces and things like that. And yet all of the discussion has been about construction, all of it. And there's been zero evidence provided at any point that the construction industry has a wage problem here in Regina. In fact, all of the evidence that you've been provided, both by delegates and by your own administration, has told you the opposite, that construction in Regina does not have a wage problem. We've also heard the idea that bidders will welcome the change because it will remove wage-based considerations from bidding. However, yet again, we have not received any evidence at all that this is in fact the case. I represent the construction industry, the hundreds and hundreds of employers, thousands, who work across Saskatchewan. Most of our prominent members are the primary bidders on construction projects that the City of Regina undertakes. And they tell me, as you'll hear from other delegates, that wages are not a consideration now when it comes to bidding, and it's not a factor in who wins or who loses, because there's not wide variances in wages across the construction industry. So I can say definitively that that is not a problem. I can also say definitively from talking to these construction leaders over the last few days, and I know many of them have been speaking to you as well, that putting this policy in place will be one more barrier for them in considering whether or not to bid on City of Regina work. We've also heard that companies in construction are already paying well, so why do we need to do this? We don't have a problem. And I really think that the problem isn't trying to solve fair wage in construction. The problem is trying to introduce a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. So here's where I think we're at. Fair wages are a good idea. People should be paid fairly. They should be properly rewarded and awarded for their labor. However, construction does not have a wage problem anywhere along the employment spectrum. That's clear. There's been no evidence provided to justify the inclusion of a fair wage policy, and it seems clear that it's a solution introduced without a problem. Maybe not the best strategy. At least that's true when it comes to construction. So let's be 100% clear. A fair wage policy will increase the cost of construction, and it will make the City of Regina less competitive when it comes to attracting quality local bidders. And as a result of that, it in effect becomes a taxpayer-subsidized increase to construction. So that's the decision, I believe, that you're confronted with as council, especially in light of the fact that you have a clear recommendation from your administration and from the industry that represents the people who bid on this work telling you that this is not a good idea. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cooper. I have some questions from council. Councillor Mancinelli.
I guess in terms of the mention of this having to do with construction, would it surprise you the conversation has revolved around construction because of the representatives from the lobby groups of construction being in the meetings, and thereby that being the groups that we've had to talk about? Just for terms, there's been $35 million worth of goods and services outside of the construction for Regina for procurement. And I was just wondering if you were aware of that.
Oh, I'm very aware of the fact that construction is the biggest spend in procurement, right? And so when it comes to procurement conversations, it should be at the center of the conversation. I'm biased, but I like it when any conversation centers on construction. And so I don't have any problem talking about construction. The issue is here we're talking about a fair wage, right? And the question of whether or not a fair wage policy is necessary. And I think, no, I don't think, I know that the evidence that's been presented to council, both by your administration and by delegates, has been clear that it's not necessary when it comes to construction. And so, there was in passing comments made by councillors during the executive committee that that part of the rationale behind this is introducing it to address other issues related to other industries where wages may be lower, right? I mean, and so below the living wage. And I think that's legitimate, and I think that those are things that should be looked at. And I think that the City of Regina can have a fair wage policy relating to certain industries where there's a clear problem without it applying carte blanche to all industries, right? You don't have to have one solution to fit every situation, especially if you don't have a problem. So if you have industries that need to be targeted, listen, we're an industry association, and if there are bad actors that need to be targeted, those bad actors need to be targeted, and we as an industry will stand up and we will call them out, right? But we don't have that problem when it comes to fair wages with construction in Regina or in Saskatchewan. So respectfully, I would say focus the solution on the problem, not on all situations.
Okay, I guess just to break this down a hair, my first question was, were you aware that the city spends $35 million outside of construction every year? So construction is our largest, 134 million, but 35 million spent on goods and services, non-professional.
Right.
In the industries that might be paying low wages. I just wanted to make sure you knew that's what we're discussing.
Yeah.
And this is a procurement policy, not a construction procurement policy, so it
Right.
kind of falls under with construction. So if you're feeling targeted in construction, I just was wondering if that might be a feeling that's been felt by your industry, somewhat targeted by this policy? Is that
Yes.
what's going on?
Yes.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. I guess to follow up on that, being that this is over and above construction, and I believe you fully when you say construction agencies already pay over and above, would it be a problem to get an extra point on a procurement sheet, being that you're all paying over and above? If you are paying a fair wage just by self-reporting, would it be burdensome or problematic just to admit that you're paying your guys deadly?
Well, if just saying, hey, yeah, we pay people above that would be enough, then maybe not, but it won't be enough, right? That's the problem, because there's gonna, rightly so, there has to be an auditable trail when you request something. Not only that, but now all of your procurement officials have to be of the same understanding of how to value that and what is fair and what isn't fair. So it's not as simple as just saying, do you pay your people enough, yes or no, right? It will require, and your own administration will tell you, it will require the development, of course, of the policies and the procedures and an understanding of that and testing of all of that. So it's going to take a lot of time and energy and effort to achieve what? What does it achieve?
I'm sorry, I
when it
can't
comes
answer
to
questions
construction.
I have to
I
ask.
know that, and that's okay. But I would point out that that question has not been answered. And so, you know, it's one thing to say that we should continue to have more discussions about how we address fair wage issues where it's a problem. It's another thing to say, let's go and develop a fair wage policy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mancinelli. Councillor Bresciani.
Thank you very much. You had just spoke about the cost. You said the cost will increase, like, to construction, and then, again, just can you elaborate on that, through the chair?
Yeah, so, I mean, what we've, risk and work translate into cost, right, in construction. And so if you're bidding for something and you factor in the extra time and energy and effort that's necessary to comply with a new regulation, then the company, rightly so, prices that in to their bidding. Today, the City of Regina gets higher pricing on some of your bids than you would otherwise because of some of the you know, challenging contractual obligations that we've talked about in previous discussions. I think that's going to change as administration continues to work with industry to work that out. But the reason that happens is because contractors price in the cost of doing business with the City of Regina into their bids. And so, yes, absolutely, you will see increase because of that, the additional administration that's placed on the city. And so you will get bids. Those bids will be competitive with each other, but there will be a cost with that the city is paying as a result of that. So, and if the benefit outweighs the cost, that's a decision that, of course, council is empowered to make. But I think it's important to really look at whether or not you have the evidence before you to be able to make that conclusion. And so because as I said, where the cost comes in is it gets built into the bid. The other thing that I would say is, you know, comparing Regina to Vancouver or Toronto is an interesting analysis. The reality is that the construction marketplace in Saskatchewan is not nearly the size of Vancouver, Toronto. So just as an example, Toronto needs more construction workers in the next decade for condo development than Saskatchewan has construction workers, right? So totally different scale, and I'm not suggesting that one is better or worse than the other at all. But what I would say is that a policy introduced by, say, the City of Vancouver or the City of Toronto, whether 100-year-old or not, has a much smaller impact in a bigger market than a policy introduced by the City of Regina, which is one of the biggest procurers of services in the Regina area. And so it's an outweighed responsibility that belongs to the City of Regina to understand the impact of the moves you make in the marketplace.
Thank you for that. And then I guess the last question, just off of Councillor Mancinelli's question, was if we create a question and they get a tick because they're paying a living wage, again, how would that be monitored in your view? And is there, for every wage, is there deemed a living wage? Who determines that? And is there some subjectivity that upon that as well, through the chair?
Yeah, for sure there is subjectivity. I mean, so the way it works with, say, the federal government program, which is technically no longer functioning, although it does, because there's still some projects that were carryover from, I think, 2014 when it was shut down. And so if you look online, you'll see the, the federal government's fair wages for Saskatchewan in construction, which are far too low, in my opinion. But they're there, right? And those are established. So somebody had to establish that, right? And those change year in and year out, right, based on the conditions in the marketplace. So those have to be monitored and maintained. They have to be, of course, discussed and developed, I would assume, in collaboration and discussion with industry and labor. And then they have to be reported on, because if you're asking for something, so there's two parts. One, if you're asking for something, it has to be properly collected and documented so that it can be audited, right? You have a responsibility with the public purse to be able to do that. So your administration is certainly going to have cost, and that burden is going to be put onto the contractor, so the cost will be put back onto the city. The other piece is, if it's simply a tick box and a point, and everybody's already above it, what have you accomplished? Everybody gets another point. Congratulations, what has that achieved? And so really, again, comes back to something that is frankly wholly unnecessary, at least when it comes to construction. So, you want to apply it to other industries. I'm not going to suggest you should or shouldn't, but that's a different conversation. But you don't need to apply it to construction.
Thank you very much. That's all I have.
Councillor Bresciani. Councillor Stevens.
Thank you. Through the chair. You've talked about the burden and cost.
Yeah.
When your members submit bids to the city, do they incorporate labor costs into their bidding?
Mm-hmm.
Do your members make that number up, or do they base it on compensation packages that they know and therefore reflect in the bid? So they understand the cost.
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
So does the city audit your receipts when it comes to how much a company pays for raw materials like steel or other goods required for construction?
I would assume that, but I don't actually know that happens, Councillor.
Can you account for the costs associated to businesses in small municipalities where these policies exist? How many got starved out of the market? Did it make it more expensive? Is there any way to track that? I haven't been able to find any evidence.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely, it's trackable in the sense of, and I think my colleague Kevin, so not to put you on the spot, Kevin, but when he comes up, he's going to talk to you a little bit about some of the impact of increases in construction costs in terms of the loss of bids, and so hopefully he is going to talk about that, because I think he is. So he'll probably be able to better address that, Councillor. I apologize that I don't have that, but he will be able to give you a little more info on that.
We're talking about construction simply because you're sitting in that chair.
Yeah, yeah.
If you remove journey persons, how does that affect the average wage rate, like if we're comparing it to laborers and others?
Yeah, so you still have the same, I mean, if you remove journey persons, it would obviously lower the average wage. If you removed first-year apprentices, it would increase it, right? I mean, that's the nature of a gradient industry and workforce. The question, I think, is, do you have a significant portion, or really any portion at all, of the construction labor force, especially apprentices, making below a living wage, right? And I think without the definitive evidence in front of me, which I'd like to point out none of us has, it's not clear to me that we have a problem.
In jurisdictions where they have implemented living wages and fair wage policies, industry came forward and said the same thing. Mm-hmm. If you look at the outcomes, there was then evidence, because of the inspectorate system, of unpaid hours, unpaid overtime, undue classification of workers, underpayment of wages, non-payment, underreporting of hours, etc. So in other words, we find problems when we have a system in place. Everyone's said they're honest in all of these jurisdictions, yet it finds that.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
Yeah. No, I mean, would it surprise me that there are bad actors? No. Would it surprise me if those bad actors make up anything more than a 1 or 2% of the industry? Yeah, it would. I would also, again, it's something we've talked about in previous conversations, but note that city contracts are with the general contractors, right? I'm not going to name the companies that are going to be the prominent ones, but we know who they are, the ones in our communities who do most of the commercial construction work. those contracts with those companies, the ones who are winning the vast majority of these bids and doing this work, they're the ones, of course, that are talking to me and saying that they have concerns about this policy and what it will mean for them and for their cost to do business with the city. But they're not the bad actors, right? And so if the issue is how do we target companies that are paying their people poorly, I think that's a good conversation to have. I think that's something we can have together. I'm not sure that the right approach, in fact, I'm sure that that it is not the right approach to have a blanket solution that says because there may be some bad actors, probably are, but maybe, we don't have that definitive evidence here, because there may be, we're therefore going to treat everybody with the same approach.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stevens. Councillor Stanichuk.
Thank you. Through the chair, I want to follow up on points that were made by the president of the Saskatchewan Federation of Labour. She talked a lot about apprenticeship, and that, about the hiring. So we know that in the construction industry, people are paid well, as you have said many times. Many of them are trades.
Yeah.
But what about that system of going through the apprenticeship system so that people are earning a good wage while they're going through that? Is that something that needs to be addressed? Do you believe that?
So me personally, yes, not through a fair wage policy, but yes. And so it's, I think Lori is right, and I think that Jeff and others that you will hear from, and Dion, who wasn't here with us, are right about the fact, and you heard me say in our meeting last week, that the further professionalization of the trades is important for the industry, right? And that industry-driven model, where we have more trades that are compulsory, which is a provincial policy matter, but I think there's ways we can collaborate together, owners like the city and the industry, will have the knock-on effect of creating more local training, which is important for where that training doesn't exist, and it will further lead to more consistent gradients in the salary increases, right? Because there's a schedule laid out through that, which is important. And so I think where as a industry and as a province we can move to have more compulsory trades, that's good for construction and good for the province as well, because it creates that standardization, which makes it more likely from a workforce standpoint that we will have more Red Seal journey people and more trades that then can be mobile and we can attract more here. So I think that's a good strategy. I don't think that the tactic of a fair wage policy moves us in that direction.
Okay. Secondly, through the chair, you've commented a lot that we don't have, there's some information that we don't have. I actually tried to get some information from the City of North Vancouver, which has a fair wage policy, just to try to understand a little bit more about theirs. I do know that their schedule is just the trades that's in their schedule, who probably would be paid well anyway. Have you had a chance to talk to any other jurisdictions, so counterparts in other jurisdictions, where they have to abide by a fair wage policy in terms of how difficult it is to administer or comply with?
Yeah, I think in fact, I was talking just recently with colleagues from the British Columbia Construction Association about some of the challenges in the market there. And it kind of led to the comment that I made a few minutes earlier, where I talked about the comparison between markets is fair to some extent, but each market is unique too, right? And so in the case of Vancouver, the City of North Van is a relatively small purchaser in the scope of all of the procurement that happens in the city, right? And so not every contractor, in fact, most of the large-scale commercial contractors aren't pursuing a lot of that work. That's not the case here, right? Here, in the case of the City of Regina, it is one of the largest. I can't say the largest. I'm guessing the province is larger, and maybe there's some others, but you're definitely going to be in the top, 5, right? Procurers of construction services. So you're a key driver for the construction industry in terms of employment, in terms of success, in terms of the growth of new and emerging small businesses. And so a policy implemented here it has greater weight than it would, say, in North Van. And as a result of that, I think it requires that extra diligence to make sure that it's a solution that is meeting a problem.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stanichuk. Seeing no further questions from council, I'll thank you very much for appearing. Mr. Cooper, and ask you to return to the gallery. I'll call upon Delegation Tony Plater. Mr. Plater, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself for the record, the organization you're representing, and where you happen to live. You'll have 5 minutes to address council, after which time you'll have the opportunity to answer their questions. Good afternoon. Good evening.
Thank you, Mayor.
Good evening, I guess.
Good evening. I'm Tony Plater. I'm the new CEO of the Regina and District Chamber of Commerce, and it's my privilege to be speaking to you today. I live in Grand Coulee, Saskatchewan. I am the AND District of the Chamber of Commerce. I want to start by thanking you for your commitment to serve Regina and the citizens and our business community. Today I'm here to speak against implementing the proposed fair wage policy. Regina was built on the backs of small and medium business owners, and people continue to make Regina home because of the great entrepreneurial opportunities we have. After review and on behalf of our membership, we strongly agree with administration's recommendation not to implement the fair wage policy. While the fair wage policy is well intended, we feel it's unnecessary and could be seen as a detriment to the growth and prosperity of small business in our community. Our membership believes that a fair wage policy will add unnecessary labor and administrative costs to their business. These extra costs will discourage small to medium businesses from participating in the civic RFP process. Having limited competitive bidders may also drive up the city's procurement costs. We've heard from construction industry experts, Kevin Dureau, Mark Cooper, and Chantal Lipp, who's going to be coming up. They've confirmed that wages in the construction sector are strong and far above the provincial average. With the current labor shortages in all industries, companies that do not provide a fair wage and benefit package will lose their talented workers to companies that do have that. We believe business owners in the industry need to provide a fair wage to remain successful. They understand all the costs associated with retaining a talented workforce, secure winning bids, and maintaining a profitable business. Approving the fair wage policy could also add to the city's cost in administration, as each project would need to be regulated and final costs reviewed. Could these increased administrative costs be better spent providing additional services or infrastructure upgrades that will benefit all our residents? I believe they could. We would also be happy as the Chamber to assist City Council and administration in sharing best practices for civic procurement with our members. This could be in the form of sharing documents or in-person teaching sessions to make sure the civic bidding process becomes more competitive and our members understand what needs to be done to be able to secure some of these contracts. In closing, the fair wage policy would not allow the city to truly shop local, as it would eliminate some of our small to medium businesses from your RFP process. Thank you again for the opportunity to present on this important issue. And on behalf of our Regina and District Chamber of Commerce members, I'm looking forward to working with each and every one of you as we continue to build a prosperous and welcoming Regina. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Plater. I have a question from Councillor Stevens.
Great, thank you.
Yes, sir.
I have a question about the small business claim. The provincial data shows us that most small businesses are actually in higher wage sectors. How are they disadvantaged by this?
Well, the first portion is that they're not sure exactly what that fair wage policy is going to look like. And so there seems to be, among our members that we polled, a question of what is that going to do for my business? If I'm already paying a higher wage to keep some of my talented people, what more do I have to give, and how's that going to affect the longevity of my business?
How many small businesses are your members apply for and succeed on city bidding?
I don't have that number, But I would assume that there's some on the construction side, as well as some of the goods and services are RFPs that Councillor Mancinelli mentioned as well.
Final question. So uncertainty seems to be the biggest concern. So that just needs to be remedied with communication and informing people about existing fair and living wage policies, would it not?
Communication is always the best way to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Their concern is that they're not going to be able to compete with the bigger companies who may have to, because they may have 2 or 3 accountants that can help administrate, where a smaller business may only have 1 bookkeeper, and we're adding to that. Cost.
Through the chair, would it not be simpler for them to abide by it? They'd have fewer employees, fewer responsibilities versus a complex supply chain and larger corporations?
There would be more work put on the actual staff that are there to be part of that process. And that's their fear right now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stephens. I see no further questions from council. Thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
presenting today. You ready? I'll call upon Delegation Thomas Benjo. I'll ask that you state your name for the record and the organization you're representing, and you'll have 5 minutes to address City Council, after which time you'll have the opportunity to answer any questions they may have for you. Good evening, Mr. Benjo.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for giving me the time today. My name is Thomas Benjo. I'm the President and CEO of FHQ Developments, which is located on Treaty 4 territory here in Regina. So thank you for giving us the time today. I just wanted to address a few items. Just, one, we're quite happy in seeing the city make progress towards the Indigenous procurement policy. And I know there's been some discussions around fair wage and some other areas, but I wanted to address 2 things on the Indigenous engagement policy. One, I did listen into Exec Council last week, and just would like Council to and administration to consider an increase of the total capital spend. I know there was discussion around a 5% total capital spend, and I think that was in reflection of what the federal government has been doing. And the federal government's position, of course, at the time when they did establish the 5% total capital spend, was based on the total Indigenous population across Canada, which of course is 4.9% based on the 2016 census. Regina itself, based on the 2016 census, is in the Indigenous population does make up 9.88%. So opportunity to round to that 10% if we're going to reflect sort of what the federal government has done. And I've been a part of those discussions and have been a key advocate in making those changes with the federal government over the past number of years. The second issue on the Indigenous procurement policy is the Indigenous ownership piece. The area around having a 51% majority Indigenous-owned business is an appropriate measure that is used universally right across Canada and in different levels of organizations. The only piece to this that is a bit concerning to me is the total number of Indigenous employees to make up 30% of the total staff if you're above 6 employees. This scenario could pose a major barrier for Indigenous businesses, especially in highly technical roles where we may not have the Indigenous talent available. We put best efforts forward to ensuring that we meet at least 35% in our businesses, but that's not always the case to have that level of Indigenous workforce. And it's just because of the highly technical roles that we still need to develop more of our people into. So that is going to create a barrier for us. So would like council to make some considerations there on the terms around what counts as an Indigenous-owned business. I did hear a number of discussions around the fair wage issues. For our organization, we are involved in multiple industries, and one being construction, where I would echo some of the comments, same as the other construction industry representatives. Fair wage for the staff that we have in the construction part of our business, that it's not an issue for us. We do pay our people very well, and it is because of the nature of the market, right? It's a very, very competitive market at this point in time, and so we have to pay significant wages for our staff in order for us to be able to maintain them. It's still competitive, so we have to acknowledge those types of scenarios. Where it does get a little interesting for us is in some of the other industries. I know when we look at things like janitorial, we're often being told by customers, sharpen your pencils and make cost cuts. And, you have to fall within these parameters. And, we've done that for a number of our customers. And the one area where, we try not to touch too much because we believe in livelihood is around wages. But, as we get more and more pressure to sharpen those pencils, as we're often told, we have to have that flexibility to make decisions as a business of, where are we going to have to make cuts in order to be able to get our foot in the door and to be able to bid on these projects. Now, if there are stipulations that stop us from having that flexibility to bid and put us at a disadvantage, then, again, we're putting barriers on potential startup Indigenous businesses that, need to run a bit lean at the start. So, when it comes to, any of the skilled trades, again, that's very, very important to us, and we're making all of these additional investments in the community to ensure that we have skilled trades within our business. And in some cases, we are not required to have skilled trades on certain types of functions of contracts. So again, having that flexibility is important to us. Again, startup, making sure we can manage our costs effectively and be competitive, because for a lot of Indigenous businesses that are starting up, it is very, very important that we work very hard to get our foot in the door so that we can demonstrate our capacity and our capabilities of being able to deliver on those contracts. And so we need that little bit of flexibility at the start, and over time we're able to have some more advanced processes and are able to cover some burdens as we establish a larger portfolio of business with certain customers. So, again, I want to thank everyone for developing the Indigenous procurement policy, and again, and encourage consulting with First Nations businesses in this process. Thank you.
Mr. Benjo, do you have a few minutes to take some questions from council?
I do, yeah.
Okay. Councillor LeBlanc.
Thank you. I appreciate your concern about being able to employ 30% Indigenous folks, that despite your best efforts, that's sometimes hard to hit. Is your suggestion that we remove the requirement for a set percentage of Indigenous folks working altogether, or just that we lower it below 30? And if it is to lower, do you have a recommendation on where we set that? That might be reasonable.
In a lot of the procurement policies or Indigenous procurement policies that we work under, I've never seen a scenario where we've had to meet a 30% or any percentage of Indigenous workforce. It's in the nature and the way that we manage our businesses, and any Indigenous business owner, we're very focused on community, and so it is putting our best efforts forward and making sure that our people are employed and trained and created into leadership roles within our organizations. But when I think about some of the really highly technical type of businesses that we are currently looking at investing in. The access to that level of technical expertise is non-existent right now, especially in the IT sector for certain types of work that we're looking at doing in the future and potentially bidding on with the city as the city advances their IT infrastructure. We need that flexibility there, and this would put a great strain on us. But it's for us, it's always a chicken and the egg scenario, right? So we need to be able to win the business first, be able to get in, do the contracts, work with our partners, and allow our partners to transfer that capacity over to more Indigenous employees. So that's always been the strategy of our organization, and I know a lot of Indigenous organizations do employ or deploy that type of strategy.
Thank you. We've seen some comment at Appendix D of our initial report that talks about set aside, I think is the term used by the federal government. So it's some RFPs that only Indigenous organizations as defined can apply to. Have you ever come across those, and do you have any general reflections on whether that would be a good idea for us in this policy?
Yeah, we actually have a number of customers that do have specific set-aside programs for Indigenous businesses. We are an organization that does receive some of those benefits from time to time with certain customers. And the way that those programs work is we get a little bit more support so that we are able to better understand processes because every customer is different in how they accept a bid, how they go through the weighting process of the bid. And, being a new Indigenous business coming into the organization could often be very daunting. And so getting that extra support and being able to do that in a scenario where a customer like the city may feel comfortable around awarding certain types of work towards Indigenous businesses would mean that it's a number of Indigenous businesses that would still have to qualify, but would then have that opportunity to bid specifically on that type of work that the city has set aside. So it does encourage greater participation, but also gives that additional support for those businesses to catch up to the systems very quickly.
Thank you. And final question, if we're looking to award work to businesses owned 50+% by Indigenous, we need to know who's in fact Indigenous. We know that's a thing people are dishonest about sometimes. You don't have to tell me what the best practice is, but is there an emerging best practice for vetting that sort of thing which community can share with the city as we develop this policy to ensure people claiming to be Indigenous are in fact Indigenous?
So I would actually ask for the legal agreements that make up that business. We share that with our customers all the time, whether they ask for it or not. We always want to make sure that they understand that we are Indigenous owned and we are able to demonstrate, that our business is owned, by 11 First Nations and our tribal council. But when we do create a new business together, that FHQ developments and all of those legal agreements actually go with it. And so there's limited partnership agreements or shareholders agreement. There may be different legal requests, but so there's actually a process of registering and making sure that you qualify as an Indigenous business. That a lot of organizations, crown corporations will use to make sure that they're qualifying us as an Indigenous business.
Just one final question flowing from that. Is it your view that businesses owned by Indigenous organizations or nations should be treated the same as businesses owned by Indigenous humans under the agreement? Indigenous owned means Indigenous nations or Indigenous people would be treated the same under the policy.
Yeah, in these types of scenarios, I know this was up for discussion on a number of occasions where we have given advice around Indigenous procurement policies. I do believe that there should be weighting that is put towards the type of Indigenous ownership there is, whether that's an individual-owned or a community-owned Indigenous business. And that being because the nature of benefits back to the community is very, very different. A community-owned business focuses on, benefits back to the nation that is the owner of the business or nations. And so there's multiple beneficiaries in that scenario where it is community-owned versus, a single owner where it's, an individual beneficiary that is receiving benefit from those types of contracts. So I think having a weighting scale of saying, there's going to be more weight given to a community-owned Indigenous organization versus an individual-owned, I think there should be some weighting that is placed on that.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions.
Thank you, Councillor LeBlanc. Councillor Stanachek.
Through the chair, I want to follow up on your recommendation around, your first recommendation increasing the procurement target to 10% from 5%. Do you see this as an immediate target or a phased-in target?
I think it's a phased-in target. It's obviously just like the discussion we had with the federal government. It's a stretch goal, right? But we should set a time frame and a benchmark when we're going to hit that amount. If that's working on this over the next 5 years, there's a lot of processes and a lot of training that's going to have to happen for administration to change the nature of how they look at including more Indigenous businesses and taking the time to work with those businesses so that they are following some of the processes that the city has in place. So it may require workshops, and so some of those resources I think will be critical. To say that we're going to hit 10% within the next year, I don't think that is going to be achievable as we kind of work through all of these processes. Can we hit that within the next 5 years? I absolutely believe we can. And I look at just, the nature of businesses that we have within our portfolio. We are able to demonstrate significant capacity already, and just within our organization alone. So as we bring other nation-owned businesses into the city's supply chain, I think, that is absolutely achievable.
Okay, thank you. And through the chair, do you feel that this policy would also, if there aren't enough Indigenous businesses available now to be bidding on jobs, that this policy could spur the development of additional Indigenous businesses that would be prepared to bid on projects?
Yeah, once you have this policy in place, you're going to see a tremendous amount of Indigenous businesses now approaching the city. It's, just like the Construction Association, spoke about, when we do try to bid on projects and we bid and we lose, well, that comes at a cost to us. And so when we don't have some of these competitive advantages, being an Indigenous business and having an Indigenous procurement policy, it gives us some better likelihood of winning contracts. And so, we're going to choose to work with those customers that are committed to Indigenous reconciliation through procurement. So we are going to focus on those organizations that have these policies in place. Because if they don't, we have bid on projects with the city over the past few years, and we're starting to see some successes now, but it's taken quite some time, and it's taken some scenarios where we have lost bids. And, that takes a lot of time and resources from my team every time we lose a bid, it does come at a cost to us. So we have to be very, very strategic on what we choose. And so opening up this policy and, you know, demonstrating to the Indigenous business community that, you know, the City of Regina is really open for business for them now, I think you're going to see a tremendous amount of new suppliers approaching the city.
Thank you. And my final question, your example about janitorial services and being undercut or, you know, push for lower wages, do you see a value in if there's a requirement to pay at least a minimum, like it would be a floor, not a ceiling, but a floor, a minimum wage in the contract that you're at least on a level playing field?
You know, if it's a requirement for everyone and they make it a level playing field, like it's where it makes it the most difficult for us, because a lot of the competitors that we have had to go up against, like, they're willing to pay the lowest possible wage for those workers, and that's just something that we don't feel good about. And so making sure that there is a bit of a floor for those kind of scenarios and ensuring that my competitors have to pay a fair wage, and in those scenarios absolutely makes it more competitive for us. Okay. You know, it's more in alignment with the things that we value.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Stadenchuk. Mr. Benjo, I just have a couple questions. Last week at Executive, when we were advancing this, there was acknowledgement this procurement policy is not in its final form, simply an update. There was a commitment from administration to move forward in partnership with folks like yourselves and other Indigenous-owned businesses and organizations, ECDEV companies. Are you comfortable, if we advance it as it is, that work over the fall prior to December of this year proceeds as it exists right now with the intention of coming out the other side, something built for Regina, by Regina?
Absolutely. Yeah, we're willing to roll up our sleeves and help make sure that this is, you know, one of the best examples of Indigenous procurement across Canada. It's, you know, one of the jurisdictions in Canada that is most important to us, and making sure that we do this right. And I want to see us become leaders in demonstrating how, you know, successful Regina has been, and you know, in their reconciliation efforts. So we're happy to help in any way possible, and we're always open to having tough conversations about some of the how policy could reflect and create issues for Indigenous businesses, and always open for any issues that the city may see in any of the suggestions that we may have as well. So we're always open.
Thank you. One final question, and then I'm going to let you get on with your night. There's been much talk about leveling the playing field, and I was quite struck by you speaking about Indigenous startups, or when you're trying to get your foot in the door to gain experience to employ people. This notion of a level playing field, is the issue not that you're bidding on multiple jobs, not just the City of Regina, and so to have a fair wage policy apply only at the City of Regina actually hampers you to bid kind of citywide or around the province, because you've now set a floor for the City of Regina bids that you will lose every other bid, anybody else without this policy?
Yeah, it would require us to have a bit of a, well, when I look at the other procurement or bids that we have across Saskatchewan, because I mean we're bidding in multiple jurisdictions, not just Saskatchewan, but Manitoba, Alberta, BC, Ontario. In those scenarios, fair wage has never actually come up in any of our any of the RFPs that we've seen. So it is, if this is to become policy for the city, we'd have to adjust, what that would mean for us. And, I feel like I don't have enough information to really determine, how is this really going to cost us at the end of the day, and how much additional work will we have to do on a specific bid to demonstrate that we are paying a fair wage. So I would need, a significant amount more information on exactly what that additional work would look like and what that cost would be to our estimation teams and them having to do that work in order to bid.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that answer. Thanks very much, Mr. Benjo. There's no further questions from council. Thanks for presenting this evening, and you can go on with your day.
All right. Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.
I'll have you introduce, say your name for the record, the organization you're representing, as well as where you reside. You'll have 5 minutes to present to council, after which you'll have the opportunity to answer any questions they have. So good evening.
All right. Thank you very much, Your Worship, Mayor Masters, and councillors. Thank you for extending your time tonight. My name is Jeff Sweet. I'm a journeyperson cook and construction electrician. I am the president of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 2038, here in Regina, Saskatchewan, and I live in Regina in Ward 3. I'd like to start off by saying that 5 minutes isn't nearly enough time to address this issue. To explain it properly, I think would take hours, although I'm sure you guys have done your own reading and research. Last week when I addressed council in regards to the fair wage policy, I cited the same 2014 study by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives that the city did in its own report. That paper was a condensed look, an analysis of the metadata on fair wage policies across the US and Canada. And with only 5 minutes, it went really fast last week, so I will just quote the study's conclusion, and that was: the preponderance of econometric research suggests that fair wage policies do not significantly increase overall construction costs. I did include that in my written submission a year ago, and I hope that councillors have had a chance to look at it for that information. The paper also cites many examples showing that fair wage policies have no impact on the number of bidders on a project, specifically footnote 86. There is some note in that paper that some of the studies that they used were not statistically significant enough. In that case, though, there were 140 projects used and over 5 different districts, and there was no impact on the number of bidders. The average wage for construction workers has been talked about here in these meetings, and they are based, I believe, on a journeyperson's wage, not all workers in the industry. And this is because, except for compulsory trades, there is no requirement to hire journeypersons or apprentices in a construction trade, and this leads to employers doing exactly that, hiring workers without credentials, calling them laborers, and paying them a reduced rate. And the average wage could be $100 an hour. If almost everyone is making $20 an hour, the number is meaningless. This leads me to apprenticeships. I don't have anything more to say on fair wage policy, really. I understand that the motion stands as having apprenticeship worked into your company is worth community benefits points rather than an actual mandatory apprenticeship requirement. Baby steps. I think I'm okay with that for now, but the construction industry for a long time now has been saying that we are on the verge of a skilled worker shortage for almost 20 years probably. And I think that this is an excellent opportunity to shore that shortage up and train workers into trades, but also to give them the credentials that go along with that to prove it to a later employer. Buildforce Canada, with input from many industry players, including some who have spoken here, issues a report each year, and these reports include forecasts of projects and labor requirements. This year's report states for Saskatchewan, and I quote, "Total industry employment is expected to rise by close to 3,100 workers, or 9% to 2023, led by strong gains in ICI, or industrial, commercial, and institutional building construction, engineering construction, and residential renovation activity. Requirements recede as several major projects end, but employment remains high by 1,500 workers in 2027 relative to 2021 levels. Despite benefiting from a younger age demographic, relative to most other provinces, industry must also contend with the anticipated retirement of nearly 5,000 workers to meet total hiring needs over the 6-year forecast period, unquote. And for Canada, quote, to keep pace with construction demands over the 2022 to 2027 forecast period, the labor force will need to increase by 15,900 workers, and that's on top of an estimated 156,000 workers expected to retire during this period, or 13%, a negative 13% of the 2021 labor force. This places overall hiring requirements at 171,850 workers in 2027, unquote. It only makes sense to me that the city acts now in relation to apprenticeships on their job sites. The apprenticeship system is established, it works, and it will ensure that we are guarding ourselves against a skilled worker shortage in the future. Short of any questions, that's all I have.
Thank you very much. Councillor LeBlanc.
We heard some concerns about potential bidders not knowing what constitutes a fair wage at the time of applying, and so there'd be some uncertainty. Do you have any suggestions on how, if this passes, the city can clarify and let everyone know what those fair wages are beforehand?
I think that Deanna Ogle spoke to that, but of the fair wage policies that I'm familiar with, there is a schedule laid out that shows what each trade journey person would make per hour. So I believe it would be worked out by staff based on some sort of prevailing wage studies that they would do on their own. And they're not all based on a collective agreement. I said that last week. Some of them are based on the collective agreement without pension or benefits, for example, at 100% of the wage. I believe Toronto is 100% of the total package, 80% of the total package. That includes the pension, the wage, and the benefits. But so there's, that would be looked at by staff before it was implemented.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor LeBlanc. Councillor Moll, you have a question? Councillor Moll, you're on mute if you're trying to talk.
Yeah, I realize that. I just put my hand down. Councillor LeBlanc has my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Moll. I see no further questions from council. Thank you very much for the presentation this evening, Mr. Sweet.
Thanks, everyone.
Again, I'll call upon delegation Kevin Dureau. Mr. Dureau, I'll have you introduce yourself for the record, the organization you represent, as well as where you reside, and you'll have 5 minutes to present to council, after which you'll have the opportunity to answer any questions. Good evening.
Good evening. Good evening, Mayor Masters and council. It is my privilege to once again be before you today and present, representing the construction industry, not from just Regina, but Saskatchewan, and I live in Regina, Ward 7. I'm pleased to be able to offer full support of Regina's construction companies for the recommendations outlined in the report from administration. Your administration's engagement was extensive and thorough over the past year. I am concerned that tasking them to go back and spend another year developing a plan against their own recommendation will be a significant cost and burden on the taxpayers. If implemented next year, the administrative costs for both your administration and construction companies will be passed along, once again affecting the bottom line of the city's budgets. When it comes to sustainable procurement, we agree with the recommendation outlined by the city administration. Specifically, we support the mandated requirement that contractors working for the City of Regina must have CORE or C-CORE. We would like to suggest that all city employees working in construction also take the training through the Saskatchewan Construction Safety Association, and that road crews take safety training through the Saskatchewan Heavy Safety Association as well. Aligning training for all workers, regardless of their employer, should be mandated to make safer job sites. Additionally, we support the City of Regina's desire to see all construction work in Regina being done by Regina companies and by Regina people. I wholeheartedly endorse this approach. In order to ensure that the city is able to execute on this vision, you can engage effectively with local industry to keep contractors informed about upcoming projects. Again, the pre-bid concept, letting us know what is upcoming so we can let our contractors know and plan. You can provide what we call early contractor engagement far in advance of what procurement the procurement phase. When the city is first contemplating a project, you can engage exclusively with local contractors to discuss potential solutions to a project, scopes of work, and the planned budgets and timelines. You can also use industry-driven systems like SupplierLink, Fix It Up, and the RCA Plan Room to better connect with local contractors and require reasonable and trade-compliant data points from contractors that will support local companies. You can also require contractors to be a member of an industry organization such as the Regina Construction Association, Saskatchewan Construction Association, Sask Heavy Construction Association, and the Regina Region Home Builders Association. Our collective members provide exceptional quality work and are leaders within the industry, thus why we believe a fair wage they're already overpaying. Not overpaying, but paying above the living wage. As you have heard today from many of the delegates, we agree with the administration's recommendation not to implement a so-called fair wage policy at this time. Construction wages are strong and far above the provincial average. With construction workers enjoying a strong economic advantage, these facts are well documented. A wage-based policy used by the city would not only isolate the city as the only buyer of construction services in Saskatchewan with such a policy, but it would also drive up administrative costs, which we've discussed. Over the past 2 years, the City of Regina has canceled 28 projects. 6 projects were over budget. Will the costs of this policy increase that number? I believe so. 13 cancellations were due to no bids, and we talked at length about the owner's contract challenges we face from city contracts, which we are working with administration. At what point do contractors decide the risks of uncertainty are too great, and what happens next is too great to work on city projects? This is a very real scenario that some of our contractors have decided is not worth it, and unfortunately, because they live in our great city and pay taxes, they're not bidding on City of Regina work. Labor shortages are a global problem, and for companies to be competitive, they are already paying significantly higher wages than Regina's living wage rate of $16.23 to retain and recruit employees. You have heard that construction projects costs have gone up over the past 5 years and that wages have not. This certainly is not true. The demand in the labor market requires employers to provide competitive wages, and a fair wage policy is unnecessary. Through what they're paying, they're gaining employees. Given that there is no problem to solve, it seems like a questionable policy to implement. We are still recovering from a pandemic, facing critical labor shortages in certain areas, supply chain issues, and rising costs of materials. I respectfully ask, is now the time to burden the taxpayers? Before I end, I want to thank the administration, council, for their diligence in engaging, their commitment to listening to us, their willingness to encourage different perspectives and leadership in bringing stakeholders together. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you on this important topic. On behalf of the Regina construction industry, I'm pleased to note that our companies stand ready to continue to build a prosperous, fair, and sustainable Regina. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Duro. Councillor Mancinelli.
Thank you. I spent a lot of the last week talking to many people in our community. What I figured out is many of them already meet the criteria and exceed it. In a system like this, it doesn't have to be prescriptive or stop anyone from bidding if they're not a fair wage employer, because we can set the policy how we want for our city and how we live. Viewing this, that we're going away from not just using price to figure out where our project should go, but some of the attributes of companies and how they are in our community, and knowing that all the people you represent are paying a fair wage. The people I've spoken to, I take them at their word. I believe they're paying a fair wage already. As we get busier and go through procurement, there might be people who come into our community and try to undercut on labor and cost. I'd like to reward the people I've spoken with a point system that reflects their good intention, their good standing in our community, by giving points if they choose to admit that they pay a fair wage. Do you really believe we should walk away on this and not reward people for their good efforts in our community?
You know, sir, it's a tough question. As my colleague answered before, at what point is the 1 point weighed against anything else that they've placed within their submission? Also, the costs, I want to refer to the cost. The general contractors have to gather the information and then the city staff have to verify it. That is the administrative burden that we are facing. So I know that there's a concept. I think that if we were to market and take it out of the procurement, but market that Saskatchewan contractors and the City of Regina pay a fair wage in a marketable campaign rather than a policy, I think that's a better way of looking at it. I mean, there's a way to maybe steer the messaging, but if you have a policy, I know that contractors are withdrawing from bidding, especially in a very competitive market right now. They're withdrawing because of the owner's contract conditions. That is an absolute fact. So I hope I answered your question. If there's a follow-up, I'd like to answer that.
Actually, I do have a follow-up. The complexity of a system like this, once again, we dictate policy. There is a possibility for be self-reporting, I believe, with ease. And when I look at some of the other instances in our community, like occupational health and safety, with so many different tentacles and outbreaks and put back to employers all over the place, as well as things like in my industry, SGI safety inspection, so many diverse businesses, all self-reporting through SGI standards. I deal with it every day. It's not that complicated. Being that we're the policymakers, do you not think we could make a simply implemented policy that really reflects the value of our community, in that we do have a very good cost of living balance to our wages here? And that's something we should be marketing as we look for talent to bring our way. Any comments?
You know, I think it was answered previous by my colleague from the Saskatchewan Construction Association. I'm not looking to defer, but there are points that you're making that, you know, the marketability of what Regina has to offer and what we offer as a community is that, but does it have to go into a policy? What is are we willing to risk contractors, not reputable and strong contractors, not bidding on the jobs, that we want to get best value, and best value is an idea that the city has adopted. So if we're not going to be bidding on these jobs, what is the point in putting in a policy that might defer and deflect, and we all of a sudden have somebody that comes in, does poor work, adds on to the owner's contracts that we already have right now, and then our excellent contractors start seeking to work other places. Our contractors and the people that are leaders within the organizations that we are serving, they have people that live in Regina, they're paying their wages, they're the ones who are actually going and supporting hockey teams, they're supporting baseball teams, they're community-minded people, so they're already doing that. Again, I must defer why a policy with procurement. The marketing and the messaging, I think we could take that as a city. In fact, I would suggest that we would be happy to work with the city and market our city together with the construction industry, our association, and the city together. If it was a marketing campaign, I believe there's a way to do it that way. But putting in a procurement policy really is risky, and this is on behalf of the members that have advised me. So,
thank you.
My pleasure.
Councillor Montanelli, Councillor Bresciani.
Thank you very much. In regards to the general contractor, right, would apply, then they have lots of subcontractors underneath that. How would they then have to determine whether they're paying living wages? Like, how would you see that working through the chair?
It's an excellent question, Councillor Bresciani, and I thank you for it. I would defer to the legalities of it. I'm not sure that because of the contract being with the prime, the general contractor, and the city, that is the linear line. For a general contractor to now ask, are you going to go to ask for a T4 from a sub-trade? You want the sub-trades to provide their T4s of all the employees that are working on that job. What about the job starts when you're driving from the gas station and you fill up? Are we now going to require their gas attendant to provide a T4 that is part of the whole process, start to finish? So if we're doing a portion, we have to do it all. Otherwise, there's no reason to just start with this and expand out. So it's a whole, it's more complex, I think. So.
Yeah. In regards to when you talk about the average hourly compensation for a heavy civil construction industry is, I think it's $39.84.
Yes.
It's 11.4 above the provincial industry average, which is 145% over Regina's living wage.
That's correct.
Okay. So tell me how having this in would help. Like, I don't see the benefit.
It absolutely won't help, and I'd like to state back to the trades. We are all for trades being, and I thank the Councillor Mancinelli for his where applicable, that amendment. I think that's excellent. But if you're looking at heavy construction that does not have defined trades, how does a policy like this, with also enacting trades in there, how is that going to affect any company? If you're a big, large company, and I was to respectfully house 55 people like an organization that we're in this room, and I go get a journeyman cook or a Red Seal cook, does that qualify me because I'm in the apprentice system to get points? So the lack of clarity, the lack of understanding and the stringent understanding of what we're trying to do here has not been articulated. And that's the risk that we face in going down this path without consideration to the ripple effect of the decision we're making today.
Last question, and Mayor Masters asked it kind of earlier. How does this affect businesses? So if they apply on an RFP with the city, they would have to then pay this, say, a higher wage, but then when they would go out to other, and I'm going to talk about the Indigenous, that's how it was shared, then, or anybody, but you'd go out and then all of a sudden now you would you be pay lower, or like would you adjust it, or how, what do you think?
That's a concern, because an employer that gets their check every 2 weeks or as they're working, it makes me nervous that all of a sudden we're going to be dropping wages, we're going to be raising wages, dropping wages. Let's be consistent, and as you mentioned, the 145% over the living wage is an excellent wage. We are competing for the best people. Construction, I said last week, we're working on the image of construction. We want more people to get into the trades. But the first step is not by implementing a policy, it's by trusting that the statistics, which was provided by Praxis, a study that was done, I haven't heard of many studies that have been done to verify this. So I'm deferring to what was the Saskatchewan Heavy Construction Association. They commissioned the study, so that's where these recently, so it's not old data, but that's where the information is coming from. So I don't think that 145% is unreasonable over a living wage. And as my colleague said before, there's other, there's the service industry. I used to own a bar within Regina here, a restaurant. The service industry is struggling. I would challenge us to look outside of that. So where the focus is, and I've heard the arguments, and I respect them, but I just think that in a policy we can actually do better.
Okay, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Councillor Bresciani, Councillor Stanichuk.
Thank you, Mayor Masters. Through the chair, I do want to ask you about the administrative aspects of this, because that's one of the issues you have, is that it would be an additional administrative burden or cost. Do you have certainty of that? Like, it would depend on how the policy is crafted, would it not?
Without seeing the policy, respectfully, Councillor, I can't articulate how. If I was to see definitively and there was a prescriptive menu telling us how, then I'd be able to answer. I'm not trying to deflect. I can't speak upon something that's theoretical. Right. So the policy, dependent on what it is, administrative burden absolutely is built in, as my colleague said before. Risk is attached to any project. A schedule, without defining schedule, without having the lows and awards of the job at a reasonable time. Contractors are taking that information and they're building in that risk. So for example, right now, are we going to go forward? When does that start? So if I'm bidding on a job in March and it's not to be awarded and started until, let's say, fall, without understanding the policy, we can't articulate what that looks like.
Yeah. So. Now, I think you spoke in favor, like of the Indigenous procurement aspect and the sustainability one as well?
Absolutely.
So when I look at the sustainability procurement policy proposal, the recommendations, it to me looks very like significantly onerous in terms of showing, the third-party certification of diverse or social inclusiveness, demonstrated practices of social procurement in the supply supply chain, implementing programs for underrepresented groups. It goes on and on. Environmentally friendly waste disposable practices. There's a lot there. That to me looks like that would be a lot more administratively difficult.
Actually, I disagree, and the reason is, as I mentioned before, if you used industry-driven systems like SupplierLink, it has all of ESG built into it. It has the Indigenous component built into it. So any one of our contractors, when they sign up and they're a part of the SupplierLink, Fix It Up, or even our plan, we have that data ahead of time. So to tie in with the City of Regina and to be able to have any of your procurement officials taking a look at that, we can get ahead of that. Per project, what is a fair wage on a $10 million project, let's say a stadium of $100 million? It changes per project. So the onerous conditions through technology on that is one thing, but individual general contractors, they don't know if they're getting the job. They don't know who and what subs are going to be actually working for them. So the onerous burden is taken away by technology. It's not equal or the same. What it is, it's individualized per job, and it won't be, we won't be able to do that through technology.
If, through the chair, if there were policies that we could look at, or we could design policies that, like I do know that other cities, they have a posting of the schedule. That's the schedule. Everyone knows what it is. It's the level playing field, as we've talked about before. Would that make it a lot easier?
I think honestly, through the transition of the administration that's happened, and through consultation, we are working with administration, and together we can get there. But right now, it feels like a roadblock that we're implementing to make progress. Like, for example, the owner's contracts conditions, I'm meeting with the city on a regular basis. So a lot of these issues that are happening, we're making progress. But what concerns me is to task the city administration to go back and work on a fair wage policy that they've been against, that the presentations and delegations have presented on. I mean, there's two sides. But for them to go back another year and do this, they're going to take away from some of the progress that needs to be made on the owner's contract conditions using the CCDC. We've talked about the Saskatchewan Bid Depository. But through consultation, I think that I'd rather you task the administration to figure out internally what's working, how we can work together, and then make presentations together, because I would like to support the administration on a lot of the things that we are working on together.
And so final question through the chair. You talked about, I think you did, I wrote down pre-bid workshops. I'm not sure if that's the terminology you use, but the idea of having a workshop that anyone interested in bidding on an RFP gets the information, would that help ease this whole process?
Absolutely, and we've been saying through consultation, we would love to have city officials come out and do consultation with our members, but we have to also make sure that whoever's administering that each individual has a different mindset on what the language says, and there's no consistency. So until we reach consistency, and it's either black or white or there's a gray area, we have to be able to articulate that to be able to present. Because in the debriefs with a lot of our contractors, they have a version from you, they might have a version from the person over there, and it's not consistent. So we want to get there, but through consultation, I believe that we can.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Stanachek. Councillor Stevens.
Great, thank you. So I have a question about this, I'll call it the state of confusion. I mean this in a respectful way. Since the last meeting, it took me about 2 hours to find answers to all of your uncertainties. Every municipality posts the methodology, the rates. I have a report here on the costs. All of those answers are out there for you. But what I'm hearing is that this is a new thing. We can't account for any of this stuff, but we can resolve it. Kind of curious as to why that work hasn't been done on your part, and why there's an assumption here that's an incredible administrative burden for either us or administration when this work has been done.
You know, I don't understand the first part of your question, but I can repeat that the general contractors have to gather the information, and then the city staff have to verify it respectfully. That administrative burden will cost through that risk that we built in. So the first part, when you're talking about the municipalities, can you please rephrase that or ask that again?
All of the information about how these policies are structured, the methodologies that they use, what is defined as a wage, how they're costed, et cetera, all publicly available. But you're posing this as an uncertainty and a big dilemma, but those answers have been solved, and I'm kind of curious as to why there's a disconnect.
Well, respectfully, sir, I don't feel like I'm posing it as a dilemma. I'm reporting the facts from our perspective and through our membership. So what my job is to report based upon those. My colleagues, we've done studies, so I mean, there's going to be perspectives that are different. So when you talk about other municipalities, it doesn't really affect us in other municipalities. What we're talking about is the city of Regina right here, and that's all I'm concerned about. When it comes down to the policy that our members within our organization, our taxpayers, and again, the contractors, the workers who are going to the Pats games, the Riders games, going to any of the pubs, suite, for example, we are focused on that. So what other municipalities are doing do not concern me. And you know what? We can use numbers to make anything work, but I'm just focused on that right now. So respectfully, that's
Fair enough. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stevens. You mentioned something, and I'm just going to ask, you mentioned something in your presentation about the City of Regina canceled 28 projects. When was that?
So through 2020 to 2022, there were 28 total canceled projects. 13 of them were no bids because the owner's conditions, contractors refused to bid on it. It wasn't worth their time or the risk. Again, back to the risk. There was 6 that were over budget, and so again, when an RFP is sent out and the responses that come back, there's a lot of work, as Delegate Benjo had spoken about, there's a lot of work going into preparation of that. There were 1 with no reason given, 1 was market issues, and 7 were scope changes. So those through 2020 through 2022, and it worries me, Your Worship, that again, implementing this policy with people, with our contractors, considering the risk and what is out there, that if you implement this, the cost will be added on through that risk. The city will be paying more, the taxpayers, it will be a burden upon the taxpayers because the project, and if they start seeing that the projects have gone up, then if they're over budget, 6 might turn into 17, which could turn into 22. I mean, we're talking theoretically, but these are real numbers.
Thank you very much for that clarification. I see no further, I lied, but Councillor Mole, I apologize, I missed you on the screen there. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I just want to say, Mr. Giroux, I'm pleased that the city administration is working with you directly as a result of this motion with issues that you guys have had in the past. So that's great to hear. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you said the Regina area contractors are already paying a fair wage, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So why would the contractors not bid on the Regina construction projects if they're already paying a fair wage?
Because, sir, it has nothing to do with wage. What it has to do with, and I mentioned this last week, is that the CCDC contracts, it's a construction document that is adopted throughout Canada and used by Canada. There is internal onerous conditions that are placed upon these contracts, basically null and void. They're not worth the weight that they're put on. So what happens is contracts are factoring that into the risk, and so it's nothing to do with the wage. But what it has to do with is some of the challenges. The other thing is that as a contractor, if you've bid on 5 jobs and you are supposed to receive the information on August 30th, I've bid on 5 jobs. Now I'm weighing the risk on all 5 jobs. If I don't receive the information from the city, which we have to get better at, there's no doubt about it. If I don't receive that for another 2 weeks, I cannot bid on anything else because I'm leveraged to the hilt. Then all of a sudden, it's another 7 weeks, or somebody's on holidays, and it's 10 weeks. This is what's happening, and then contractors are building in and factoring that risk. So what they've decided to do through the economy right now, and I know that you mentioned the economy last week, but they're going to bid on other projects, private or provincial or federal, because they're doing a better job of making sure that the awards are coming out on time. And our contractors also want to know the market. So whatever the bids are, privacy is not an issue. It's mandated through the trade agreements as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Hopefully these issues you're referring to are being worked on with the city.
They are, sir, and I respectfully want to give the city administration credit because they have been working unlike ever before, especially the last 2 years.
Great, that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mole. Now I see no further questions coming from council. Thank you very much, Mr. Giroux, for your presentation this evening. I'll have you return to the gallery.
Thank you very much.
I'll call upon Delegation Dion Malikoff. Please state your name for the record, the organization you're representing, and where you live. You'll have 5 minutes to address City Council, after which time you'll have the opportunity to answer any questions Council may have for you. Good evening, sir.
Hi, Dion Malikoff, Saskatchewan Building Trades.
Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm here to speak in favor of the procurement motions approved by Executive Committee. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I've heard a lot today, a lot of great stuff from a lot of great people. industry colleagues and friends, but the sky is not falling. I'll start with apprenticeship. Apprenticeship goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years. We continue to hear about a shortage of skilled trades across not only Canada, but the entire world. How do we ensure our beloved city will continue to advance our infrastructure needs during these times? It really is quite simple. We make sure the pipeline of apprenticeship is always full. Having proper training and a skilled labor force does reduce costs, believe it or not. We have a Rolodex of skilled trades right here in the city and surrounding area, contributing greatly to the local economy. Good paying jobs that ensures family trips to the Rider games, Pats games, and all the other great stuff this city has to offer. But it is hard to take the family to that kind of stuff when you are living below or at the poverty line, barely making ends meet, if you're making ends meet at all. But then we've heard today, you know, the owners are great people, absolutely pillars of our community, and maybe they'll let you come sit in the corporate box for a preseason game and maybe take the company truck to the game and stop by the company store for groceries on the way or after the game. You know, as an owner, and you are an owner, it is only right to hold your general contractors and their contractors to account, ensuring they are using proper, qualified people. Proper training and ratios have been proven to ensure a safer work site, proven to be more productive, bringing projects on time and, believe it or not, under budget. It is lazy and irresponsible to pass the buck to Saskatchewan apprenticeship to enforce. And that's all. I'll just move on to fair wage policy. It's been a long day for everyone. The misconception that it would drive up costs is laughable. It's been proven time and time again. These projects are bid on well in advance of boots on the ground. I would suggest that the generals and their subs have a look at their overhead and mandated 8% profit margins before coming at workers. It's since the dawn of time, management has always squeezed the workers before looking in the mirror. As elected officials, I do remind you it is your responsibility to look after your constituents, not corporate greed. So I do please ask you to vote in favor of the procurement motions as was previously approved by the executive committee. Thank you for your time today. You guys are doing a great job. I'll take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Mr. Malikoff. I will give council a moment. I see no, Councillor Moll, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Dion, for speaking here. My question really relates to the lean times. You know, we have a boom and bust economy. I heard that last executive committee. I can't remember who said that, but that's what we live in. We're at the start of a boom again. Hopefully that boom lasts for a long time, as the last boom did. During the lean time, during the bust time that we had over the last 5 years, we'll say, 3 to 5 years, whatever it was there any contractors that you're aware of that really cut the wages, really lowered the wages to whatever journeyman trade it may be? Are you aware of anything like that?
Well, that's the industry. I mean, that's exactly what happens. It's a very, very, very competitive industry, one of the most competitive industries out there. Yet it's a unique industry. We all have to work together to make sure the thing doesn't crumble apart. And so we do have to work together, but absolutely, when things go south, immediately the first thing they do is come after wages, and it's concessions, concession bargaining or whatever it may be to get those. And owners are no different. They're looking for deals. And they know the cycles. They know what's out there for market, and they know what they're going to have to pay. So I always actually say with government spending, to try and stay right in the middle and avoid competing with the private sector. And that way you can ensure your infrastructure, provincially, federally, whatever it may be. We're in the city here, but your roads, try not to compete with what's going on. Try to plan. And it is hard, but you try and plan so you're not competing with the private sector, because it gets quite costly, and vice versa. The owners can get quite good deals because it is so competitive.
Thank you very much. Again, this is my, in my mind, the meaning of this motion for those tough times. So the wages stay at a fair level during those difficult times out there. Thank you very much, Dion. No further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Moll. Mr. Malikoff, there's no other questions from council. However, I may have one. Building upon what Councillor Moll just had to say relative to boom and bust, if the intent of this is to catch a bottom from falling out in the market, so to guarantee a minimum, so to speak, would that mean by the same logic you'd be willing to give up to put a limit on a maximum?
Yeah, well, you know what? That's negotiating, and you know what? We've never been approached, Mayor, so great question. I can't say it's out of the question, and I can't say that it's, you know, yes or no. It's never been posed to me before. You kind of got me there, but I can't see why not. That if something like this was going to go into to protect, you know, again, an owner, the city, then why not, while you're at the table, go the other way and say, okay, you know what? If it's on the bottom, let's go to the top, vice versa. Let's try and maybe capture where they can't take advantage of us. So great question. Great, you know, I never ever thought of it from that angle.
Thank you very much, Mr. Malikoff, for presenting this evening. I'll ask that you please leave the meeting now.
Absolutely. Thank you. You guys are doing great. Take care. Bye.
I'll call upon delegation Brianna Solberg. I'll ask that you please... Oh, have you got it off? I won't hear myself echo. I'll ask you to state your name for the record and the organization you're representing and where you reside. You'll have 5 minutes to present to City Council, after which time you'll have the opportunity to answer any questions from Council. Good evening.
Good evening, Mayor Masters and Councillors. My name is Brianna Solberg. I am a Senior Policy Analyst for the Prairies in Northern Canada with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, and I reside here in Regina. On behalf of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business and our small business members in Regina, I will speak today to the motion to develop a fair wage policy. Specifically, I would like to share the impacts on local small businesses should this motion be passed. And I'll start with just the current state of local small businesses, and I'll share some of our survey data to hopefully help add to this conversation. So it should come as no surprise that local businesses continue to feel negative impacts of the pandemic. According to our data, less than half have returned to normal sales levels, and 1 in 6 are considering closing, filing for bankruptcy. 84% say that keeping up with government-imposed costs specifically is creating difficulty for their business, and 82% are struggling due to labor shortages. So we know labor shortages have been among the top concerns for small business owners over the past 12 months. Due to this competitive labor market, our survey data indicates 85% of Saskatchewan small business owners have recently increased employee compensation in order to retain and recruit staff. Additionally, as has been mentioned by most of the delegates already, the majority of small business owners are reporting that they already pay more than the minimum wage and they pay their employees fairly. Our data shows 82% of local small business owners in general are paying their staff more than the minimum. This number jumps to 97% for businesses in the construction industry. And based on our data, it's our belief that a fair wage policy would result in increased labor costs, red tape burdens for small businesses at a time when they can least afford it. Fewer businesses will be able to supply the City of Regina with goods and services, and we know that this will result in increased procurement costs for the city, ultimately borne by taxpayers at a time when they are being squeezed by inflation. So ultimately, we believe that the natural forces of supply and demand in the labor market will continue to place pressure on employers to provide competitive wages. Therefore, a fair wage policy is unnecessary at this time, and CFIB recommends that the City of Regina continue the current practice of not referencing wages in procurement documents for the foreseeable future, until more local businesses have had the chance to recover. And I'll take any questions you may have.
Thanks very much, Ms. Stolberg. I'll give council a moment to see if anyone has any questions. I don't see any. I'll thank you very much for the presentation this evening and ask that you please leave the meeting.
Thank you.
Can I have a member of council move to receive and file the written submissions from DE 22-159 Chad Fenrick of Ardell Steel, DE 22-161 Kyle Kendall of Inland Aggregates, and 22-171 Chantal Lip, Saskatchewan Heavy Construction Association, for communication CP 22-58, 61, and 62. Thank you, Councillor Hawkins, seconded by Councillor LeBlanc. Any opposed? Seeing none, carried. We'll now consider item CR 22-97. Acting Deputy Mayor Bresciani, can you please introduce the report?
Thank you. I move CR 22-97, the response to procurement. So we had a long discussion, and I think there's more to come, but it is to direct administration to investigate, design, and draft an Indigenous procurement policy, as well as approve key provisions of sustainable procurement protocol, and also approving administration's plan to provide external cross-sector suppliers coaching and training opportunities to increase awareness and participation by local business and social enterprise, and affirm the Executive Director of Financial Strategy and Sustainability ability to update the procurement manual and procurement protocol, and develop related policies to align and support the sustainable procurement policy as well. And that's it.
We need a seconder on the report. Thank you, Councillor Mancinelli. Any members of council wish to speak? Councillor Stanichuk.
First of all, I'd like to move an amendment to Appendix D, Indigenous Procurement, that recommendation number 1A would read that it directs administration to A, set an initial target of 5% of the total value of city contracts directed to Indigenous businesses by 2024 and to 10% by 2030. I have not sent this in advance, but so we'd shorten the time frame of the 5% target by 2 years, from 2026 to 2024, and then add an additional 10% target by 2030.
Councillor Stanichuk requires a seconder. Councillor Stevens. Do you wish to speak to it?
I think that the delegation, Thomas Benjo, explained it quite well, that federal target is low because it is based on the Indigenous population across Canada, which is significantly lower than the population in Saskatchewan. So a phased-in approach, I think, would give us a target. It would also signal to Indigenous businesses that we are moving to increase that target.
Thank you, Councillor Stanichuk. I have a question for you. Do you think it's appropriate that we prescribe it, or that pending administration actually determine in partnership with the Indigenous community how and when that should be phased in? I'm all for 10%, or giving the nod to administration that we're open to that, but I'm not comfortable prescribing what we've already agreed will be worked out in partnership.
Is there a way that we can, well, the fact that it says an initial target of 5%, I'm just wondering if we do want to strengthen that language, though.
Would you like to give an undertaking to administration?
Sure, then that would be better. I could require an undertaking that, with consultation with Indigenous communities, that they look at when a 10% target, what year a 10% target would be most appropriate for us to consider.
Would you withdraw your motion then?
Then I
In
would
favor of an
withdraw my
undertaking?
motion, and the seconder would, yep.
Mr. Lacey, did you wish to speak to that?
Yes, thank you. Through you, Mayor Masters, certainly we would undertake that action. I think at Exec Committee we did have a conversation about this item, 5, 10%, or what are the years that we should look at. At that point in time, we did commit to the consultation process that will be occurring over the next number of months before we bring back a final Indigenous procurement policy to you before the end of the year, that we had committed that we would have further engagement on targets. And so that I think this commitment is totally consistent with that.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Go ahead, Councillor Bresciani.
Thank you. I have a question. It was also mentioned by the delegation indicating about the Indigenous ownership. Should stipulate the 51% majority owned, but not include the total number. Like, again, I'm hoping that that would go back with consultation. If you're in consultation anyway with them, that would also be something that would be considered.
Through you, Masters, certainly, once again, that obviously would be a key component of any Indigenous procurement policy we would bring back. So yes, that certainly will be part of our consultation process. And that particular delegate you're referring to has been part of that group that we have been consulting with.
Perfect. Good enough.
In terms of the main motion, the response to procurement, any questions from council? Comments? Appears to have worn you out, guys. Councillor Bresciani, go ahead.
Okay, so I guess I have a question. Can we vote on the living wage or the fair wage policy separately?
Certainly.
Okay, thank you. You know, we've heard on both sides, obviously, but there's something that, for me, when we look at this, you know, we are already paying, and I'm going to reiterate, above the wage, the average wage. And I think, and not just by a little bit, but it's by about 145%. It's very high. I guess the one question I have is that I'm not sure what this is really going to benefit. And that's the point. Like, do we have a problem? I'm not sure when we've heard industry that they are paying above the living wage. And I think my worry is that we're going to put extra burden on business. We have just come out of a pandemic and slowly businesses are recovering. I'm not sure we as a city want to add on one more thing, which we all say this is a great thing because they're going to be certifying workers. But again, is it one more thing we want to put on business at this time? But also, no one else is doing it. And so as an employer, to come and bid on a contract here at the city, you will have to pay higher wages. But not only that, you'll have subcontractors. How do you go to your and if anyone has done this, I don't know anyone around the table, has had a contract, those sub-trades come and go. If you're lucky to keep one, they come and go because they're balancing many jobs. So if we think it's going to be really simple, I think it would be better to go out to industry and really get a good hand. We've heard from industry that, and I'm not sure that some of those will be willing to share that. I'm talking about sub-trades. And for the general contractor to go back out I'm not sure that's even, we can even access that information because it does become, I'm not sure, confidential. So I worry about that, but I think at the end of the day, if we had a problem, I would say, yes, let's fix it. I just don't think right now we have a problem. And if we want to look at a different way, if there's a small percent, like we heard, maybe 1 or 2, let's look at those organizations. But I'm not sure why we're trying to paint the brush across the whole board. So when we don't have a problem, and I'm not interested in our taxpayers having to pay more. I think we've got a lot of other initiatives that we need to take on. So I'll leave it there, but I do want to say thank you to its staff for the actual other pieces to this as well. The Indigenous component is very, very important, and I do believe, as we heard earlier, I think this will actually ignite some real good interest to start and even how to apply and looking at that. So I think that there's many good things. I guess the last question I have is, will we get when will this come back to council? When will the final draft? How will this work?
So through you, Mayor Masters, I'm assuming you're referring to the Indigenous procurement policy, and that will come back by the end of the year.
Will the whole policy come back?
The Indigenous procurement policy, yes.
And what about the other pieces of the policy?
So based on the approvals here, we'll be moving to implement everything approved here. So the changes to the procurement protocol, we will incorporate them into a protocol document. I don't see that coming back to council. What we'll take is what's been approved and what's in these reports, ensure that we add them in, and then internally, obviously, ensure that we are beginning then to utilize and exercise those components of the protocol, including the sustainable procurement protocol. So the only thing that would actually come back to council here, if the recommendations are approved, is the Indigenous procurement policy for further discussion here at council.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Councillor Regina. Councillor Stanchuk.
On the motion. So I do want to speak in favor of the fair wage policy. We have, heard a lot of information about it, and what's clear to me is that it's not going to be, if there are a lot of concerns and fears, there are ways of drafting a policy, I think, that can address some of those concerns and fears. And as we heard from one of the delegates, this is about values. It is our values as a community, and that we want to ensure that there are fair wages paid. In terms of the concern raised that, well, we're already paying fair wages, that may be the case, but there's always that should be a given and a floor. And it could be the case that a fair wage policy would set rates that the majority of people are already paying above, but it sets a floor. It's not about creating additional costs, it's about setting a floor, and people are probably already paying above that floor. So I just want to emphasize it's a floor, not a ceiling. And as we heard in terms of the owner's requirements that we've heard about for RFPs that are currently under discussion, it's not because of wage issues, it's other issues. And if companies going into the RFP process know these are the requirements, I need to do this, I need to supply that, I need to meet these conditions, and just make sure I comply with the fair wage policy. Yep, we've got that all. It makes, I think, the process quite simplified. I would hate to see, again, examples of, could be a local company and a large out-of-province company, and we could see outbidding by wages, the wages that could be the deciding factor in a current bid, like the way it is currently. By implementing a fair wage policy, again, it is creating a fair system. And I think it will reflect on our values, that we want to see this in our community.
Thank you, Councillor Stanchuk. Councillor Mancinelli.
Thank you. I guess first I just want to really make it clear to anyone who might have been listening during today that small and medium-sized business owners in Regina don't have a problem paying new people. I'm quite well aware they pay them quite well, often on the higher side of the market in my experience. Canada's built on the backbone of small business, and we have a good lifestyle here in Canada, and I think those two go together quite easily. So during the conversation it sounded like maybe small business owners don't do that. Well, that's not a real thing. I don't feel we have a problem when it comes to a fair wage issue in our city. I actually feel we have an advantage. These wage comparisons are all based on a ratio of cost of living, and we enjoy a very, very efficient cost of living in our city, and it's not something that can be replicated across the country. Being that we're changing our procurement strategy to go away based solely on price and implementing more of a rewarding system based on points, I'm looking at this fair wage as a way that I would like to award points to good players who are bidding on procurement. I'd like to strengthen businesses that have good employment practices, and from what I've heard from all the delegates, that's not a problem with our local suppliers, whether it be construction or other goods in our city. Having said that, I know that as a councillor coming out of a pandemic, part of my responsibility is to make sure we have a prosperous economy where people are comfortable in, and I don't think this has made people comfortable, because I think there's a lot of apprehension and misunderstanding about what's going on. I noticed that everyone's talked about policy from all over the country. I don't know if everyone's forgotten that we're in this room to write our own policy. We can design our own framework, our own system. We don't have to mimic anyone else. I guess if we're going to compare the fair wage, we have to compare the number or how it looks to other communities, but how we implement our community is up to us. We can be as creative and as efficient as we want to be, but I'm not willing to shake up construction and business coming out of a pandemic in our city to prove that. I would like to see this come through in some form. I think it's too important not to see it come through in our community, because we are at an advantage to this. People can come here because this is our advantage. But I think it's more important to bring everyone along for the ride than just to push it through. So I just wanted to reflect my thoughts on what was going through there. Past that, the Indigenous side of the procurement strategy, I think, is a great start. I'm very happy to be bringing a procurement strategy, especially after the time I spent talking to the community about this in the last week. I know how needed it is. I do have a couple questions from administration. Are any of our staff or any of our roadways or construction people trained in COR procedures or that type of a background to safety?
Going to give that one to Mr. Onright.
Through your worship. I think moving forward, that would need to be a discussion that we would have with the Construction Association. Our workers go through extensive training. We adhere to OH&S. We do a lot of training in-house, but I definitely would be open to sitting down with the association to have a discussion about that.
Appreciate that. Just thinking through efficiency and having multiple bids on both sides to speak the same language and live the same life would probably be really helpful in the room to understanding where they're coming from. And I really think that's all I have to say today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mancinelli. I see no other councillors. Have a question? Mr. Weary, there's been some question about the legality of applying to subtrades. Is it possible on a contract for a fair wage policy to apply to subtrades?
Mayor Masters, if there was, I think our recommendation, if there was a wish to hold subcontractors accountable, that would, in our view, have to be built into the general contract with the general contractor. We wouldn't recommend getting involved in, there's this concept of privity of contract. We contract with the general contractor. They in turn contract with the subcontractors. We're out of that second contractual relationship, and we would not recommend directly getting involved in it.
Thank you for the answer, Mr. Wary. So I have a question. Are you clear from council that we want it to apply, that those proponents of the fair wage policy want it to apply to sub-trades, but you're not recommending it apply to sub-trades? Have I got that right? It's a two-part question, I think.
Yes, our recommendation, if there was any interest on the part of council to have some accountability for the fair wage to apply to sub-trades, that it would be built into the general contractor's legal obligations. We wouldn't recommend, I think I'm just repeating myself again, we wouldn't recommend, we don't see a clear way of building it into a direct relationship with a subcontractor.
Thank you for the answer, Mr. Wary. Someone on administration want to give me a cost associated with a fair wage policy for the city of Regina as it relates to procurement?
Yes, thank you. Through you, Mayor Masters. So, the city of Vaughan has been, I think, mentioned a number of times in the chamber here by various members of council. I do know when we did our interjurisdictional research that when they were looking at implementing their policy, they were looking at a cost of approximately $200,000 annually, as well as additional FTE. I think it was about 1.5 additional FTE. And in addition to that, I think they had a one-time cost that would occur every 3 years to go out and have to update the fair wage schedules to keep them relevant and up to date. And with respect to the development of the policy, I tell council members our procurement unit is very tapped right now. As I've mentioned previously, we manage about 1,400 competitive processes a year. In addition, should the other recommendations in this report get approved, that there will be significant work both internally and with the industry to make full effect of those changes and improvements in our procurement policy. Continued work has to happen on the Indigenous procurement policy. That will take a substantial amount of their time through to the year end. And then once that does get approved, substantial work to implement that policy, both within the organization, but working with Indigenous employers in Regina and area. And finally, the efficiency review, procurement was one of the areas that undertaken, and there's a lot of work being dedicated to fulfill the recommendations coming out of that. So that's a long explanation to say likely we would seek resources from council to seek some external help for us to develop that fair wage policy that is in the recommendation before you. Consultants cost money, and I would say that cost is probably anywhere from $100,000 to $200,000 for them to initially do the policy, and then we'd probably look for them to actually, once that policy is determined, develop the actual fair wage schedules.
Thank you, Mr. Lacey. Can you tell me right now what the policy is that you believe council wants written?
I can't. I think there's a number of questions that we would need to work through as administration. We'd provide recommendations back to council, but if you're going to develop a fair wage policy, there's a number of, I think, questions we would have to ask ourselves. Yes, I have heard there are other fair wage policies out there, as I mentioned last week. That's a minority, I'd say municipalities and other government levels that have adopted fair wage, but that's not to say that they're not out there. But questions that would need to be answered as we develop it would include how you determine the source for those wage schedules. So is it union contracts that exist out there for various trade occupations and job occupations, or is it some type of a survey? Is it looking at our own costs for that? So you've got to sort out the source of where you're going to do that, and I think that needs to be outlined in the policy. Then you need to determine who that's applied to. I think generally the construction industry has been a general area that fair wage policies apply to, but it can be much broader. We've talked about it here as well. Does it apply to janitorial? Does it apply to other types of services that we go out? And so we would need to make a determination of that. Secondly would be around how do you monitor compliance with it? And the question with respect to, you know, how do you get at subcontractors is part of that piece. And, you know, compliance can be, you know, we go in and do audits and inspections ourselves. That's very resource intensive. That impacts your ongoing resources. Or is it complaint based? And so I've just laid out some of the issues I think that we would need to sort through as administration, bring back to council with recommendations, but obviously options, because I think we would need to work through that and ultimately get council's views on what exactly they would like to see in that procurement policy once we've done the additional work. Procurement policy, that fair wage policy.
Thank you, Mr. Lacey. Mr. Lacey, ballpark, our procurement budget is how much?
I'll ask Ms. Moyse basically what the procurement unit budget is. We have central stores as well, but maybe we can just talk about procurement because I think this just really focuses on our procurement activity.
Thank you, and through the chair, our procurement budget right now is approximately $1.5 million.
Oh, I apologize. I meant the total procurement into the community.
As a community, sorry. The total, it ranges from 200 to 250 million per year.
Ms. Moisey, can you tell me what percentage of that is construction?
Approximately 67%.
Going back to an answer, I got an answer to a question I didn't ask, so thank you for that. Just to verify, Mr. Lacey, a $200,000 annual budget in order to implement, because can we implement the policy without auditing it?
So, through you, Mayor Masters, you know, I've not done a deep dive into it, but, you know, in other policy development that I've been involved in where you have certain requirements for a entity to meet, there are various levels of activity that can be undertaken with respect to ensuring compliance. So you can go in and you can try and audit every contract and match up the wages being paid to your fair wage policy on a proactive basis. That would be very resource intensive. I'd be surprised we could do it within the number I provided you. Or you could take more of a what I would call a complaint approach, where you're accepting the information provided by the vendors when they bid on work. You may require them to provide some type of written assurance as to what they're telling you, but you may only then go in and either do spot audits or just complaint-based audits, which would require obviously less time, but would provide overall less assurance that there's ongoing compliance. So it's a balance, and I think it depends on how active council would wish administration to be on that. And the more active you want us to be, the bigger the cost.
I've heard mention that perhaps we could just provide it no different than we did with the apprentice thing, that we would give it a point potentially out of, and I believe if I got my accounting right, out of 16. There's 16 different points we could attribute, that, or 15, that we could make this the 16th one. So that would be 1/16 of 10% attributable to a procurement award. Do I have that right, Mr. Lacey?
Well, certainly I think if you wished, instead of making it a mandatory requirement, I think when I hear that, what I'm hearing is you're no longer making it a mandatory requirement. It's basically you get additional points if you're able to meet that requirement. I still think you get back to the same issue about how do you monitor that, how do you follow up on that, and I think you can make a determination about how much rigor you want to apply to that. But certainly you can move to a point system as opposed to making it mandatory. I think you would still need to think about how you want to ensure compliance.
This was not a recommendation of administration.
So So that is correct. Administration did not recommend the implementation of a fair wage policy. This was in part because of, in our view, the cost to develop the policy, the cost to administration for the ongoing administration of the policy, but as well, we do believe there would be additional administrative costs to companies bidding on the work. And they would either have to absorb that, or more likely that would be passed on to the city as well through the quote process. And then when we considered that in the context of the current environmental conditions that we are in, where we are seeing strong economic conditions, a very competitive labor supply market, in that overall context, we did not see the overall benefit of the city implementing a fair wage policy, certainly at this time.
By your math, sir, our procurement on this issue alone would go up 13%. Our $1.5 million procurement staff budget would go up another $200,000, so 13%. So logically, probably every small business would go up an equivalent 10 to 13% to administer.
I certainly think there would be administrative costs associated. Like I would not want to speculate about what that percentage is. Certainly ours would be in that range. Certainly that can be a benchmark for what it would cost small business. I do believe there would be an administrative component to them.
Do you think it's important that we would know what that number was before we implemented a policy?
It certainly would be additional information, I think, that would help inform council's decision.
And if I'm catching your answer to the question from 2 ago, is that there would be a hit to the taxpayers in terms of an addition of $200,000 annually, and every 3 or 4 years you're going to have a one-time increase in cost to go out and do the research that you were referencing, plus our contractors bidding on our work would also have their budgets go up in order to bid to achieve the administrative requirement to bear out that they're meeting the fair wage policy. And so the cost of doing business, of the city doing business for the taxpayer, takes a double hit.
Through you, Mayor Masters, I think when you look at the debate on this, there's a lot of arguments on both sides, but I think our view on that would be as correct as you've articulated it. I do believe there would be additional costs that contractors would incur, and I think it would be quite reasonable for them to include that cost into their pricing when they bid on city work.
And 67% of our procurement right now is paying well above a fair wage, if 67% is going into construction, correct?
67% of our procurement activity is construction, correct.
Thank you, Mr. Lacey. I appreciate the answers. I see I have a couple councillors who would now like to ask some questions. Go ahead, Councillor LeBlanc.
Thank you. I just want to start with a few procedural questions, maybe to the clerk. I understand, right, we're going to be voting on item 6 separately from the rest. Is that right?
Through you, Madam Mayor, that's correct.
Okay. And if I can ask an embarrassingly transparent question, if that vote splits 5-5, that's lost, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. I'm going to move an amendment to item 6 that directs administration to come back with a report detailing the potential terms of a fair wage policy, how fair wage would be decided, determined, and circulated in RFPs, and how it would be evaluated by Q4 of 2022. And I didn't speak to that.
Councillor Elkins, go ahead.
I'm not sure how that's an amendment.
It's not an amendment.
It's really part of the substance of the main.
Unless it's a deferral. I'll refer back to administration on number 6.
Well, the motion is to refer refer to the administration, the writing of a report that details the fair wage policy. This is just a chunk of that. So I think it's not an amendment, it's just subsumed in number 6 already.
Mr. Nickel? All right, we'll see. Who I got going? Go ahead, Mr. Lacy.
So through you, Madam Mayor, I'm, with respect to the suggested amendment, it's a little bit unclear to me because I think we would have to undertake the same work regardless to come to what the request is. So I think it is essentially the same work because to get at that inquiry would, I think, require the same work as developing a draft fair wage policy to bring back for council's consideration.
Councillor LeBlanc, is that, you're trying to get to something, I'm just curious. Like,
I think that's fair enough. I think the two comments undermine Councillor Hawkins in that what I'm suggesting lies deeply within the definition of amendment 2 sub 1 sub C of procedure bylaw. An alteration of a main motion by substituting, adding, or deleting a word or words without materially altering the basic intent of the motion. So I think given that, Councillor Hawkins is off base in suggesting I'm fundamentally recommending or changing something. I think it is a clarification of what we're speaking of. If administration understands the current wording to mean what I'm suggesting, I think that's great and we can just get on with it.
Mr. Lacy, is that how you understand it?
Yeah, no, certainly, as part of that work, we can certainly bring back those additional pieces. The only comment I would have is, I'm realistic, we're at the end of August here, and we are going to have to engage outside expertise. I think the end of Q4 is tight, and so I may ask for, an additional quarter for us to do that work.
I'm going to then...
So, we'd undertake to bring it back, I guess, as quickly as possible through you, Mayor Masters. But I haven't really had an opportunity to consult with my staff about, undertaking a process to bring in a consultant and then what that would require for us to bring back a report. So we would endeavor to make best efforts to bring that back as soon as possible. I just want to make sure that we're not setting unrealistic expectations here, that you would see something by the end of this year.
I think that's fair enough, and given administration's interpretation of the current language, I would remove my proposal to amend and just speak to the language as drafted. I think this is eminently reasonable. I think Mr. Lacy has estimated the cost of this quite fairly, maybe in the $200,000 range. That's a lot of cash, but spending $200,000 to figure out how to properly spend $200 million annually is well worthwhile. This is a significant chunk of our budget. I think if we vote this down, we risk being penny wise and pound foolish, which would not be our first time. Again, $200,000 for $200 million in a year when we're already reviewing our procurement policy in substantive ways, as Mr. Lacy spoke to. I note that one of the lenses we are taking to the procurement policy is an efficiency one. I suggest that there's an efficiency to reviewing procurement holistically rather than doing it piecemeal, some now, some later. I think it makes perfect sense to address this fair wage issue in procurement while we're addressing the others. I think 2 further points are worthwhile. So we've heard data, 67% of procurement costs go to construction. Construction has a high annual wage. 33% of $200 million, that's a lot of cash. What are the janitors getting paid? I would like to know that. I would like to not directly or indirectly employ people at poverty wages. We need that data to make decisions based on our values and our obligations. That would be point 1. The second of those would be it's simply not set in stone what this fair wage policy would look like. I know in particular, Councillor Mancinelli, you've said maybe there are concerns with us saying you're either in or you're out. It's a binary. If you're not paying fair wage as defined, you simply can't apply. Maybe we could apply points to it. I think we should have a debate about that, and we can have a real discussion about a made in Regina solution for how this ought to go. I think it makes good sense for us to at least award points for someone who's taking care of workers, residents in Regina, and not having them living in poverty. So I think we could have that discussion once we have that data, but we need to spend $200,000 to figure out how to properly spend $200 million. I think that's a good investment, so I think we should vote in favor of point 6 and have a serious debate once we know what we're really talking about. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor LeBlanc. Councillor Stevens.
Thank you. Appreciate the work on this. I do have an issue with some of the costing and the numbers that have just been provided. There's a cost to everything. I suspect by the end of this meeting, we'll have spent about $250,000 in labor time, like most council meetings. Barry knows what I'm talking about. The City of Vaughan's administration came before their council with several options that ranged between $25,000 and $155,000. This was a made in Vaughan solution. So I think what Councillor Mancinelli has said is probably the most instructive, and that we can define something that is very sensitive to the realities here, as the industry has suggested. A big chunk of what the City of Vaughan budgeted for was a consultant to develop the actual fair wage schedule. If that costs $155,000, which was the high estimate, I'm quitting my day job for 2 weeks of work. Basically, they canvassed publicly available wage data that my grad students do on a regular basis. They canvassed existing collective agreements and regional wage rates, and they put that before administration to effectively construct the fair wage schedule. We already have third-party institutions doing the research and crafting a widely accepted methodology that actually crafts a living wage. So there's 2 components. I think most importantly that, as Mr. Lacey has suggested, consultation is built into this process. We've already identified that this is important to make the procurement system effective. We didn't really haggle over costs to develop a cell phone tower policy or protocol and a number of other issues. I think this is important. So again, I'm going to refer to Councillor Mancinelli's points in that we can certainly have a made in Regina solution. Administration can provide us with a series of recommendations on what's the most appropriate in terms of enforcement. An overview of existing policies suggests that they do range from a self-declaration, a commitment in writing that the fair wage standards are being paid, and then if there is a complaint amongst some of the contractors and subcontractors or single companies, there's actually a mechanism to say we are not being compensated. And so to the industry's point, we have a simple mechanism to find the bad apples. So we can make a made in Regina solution. Administration always provides us some options. The other assumption here is that you will instill existing procurement staff to do this work and to develop a points-based system. I've seen how they function. The Indigenous procurement process, an evaluation of ESG components of those submissions, there are far more complex elements that our staff are already reviewing. I cannot understand how looking at a wage grid is more complicated than any other the sophisticated work that the procurement staff are doing. Everything has a cost, I understand that, but I would argue that we can actually do this and we can have a made in Regina solution that adapts to what we're seeing from all sides, including labor as well as industry. So that's why I'm going to be supporting this.
Thank you very much, Councillor Stevens. We have a legislative break. Councillor Bandura, I have you up next.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. Listening to the debate and hearing all this money that we're throwing around here, so I've got a question for the administrator. I'm not sure, probably for Barry. Would be do we have a budget to bring in the report? Second question would be, do we have a budget then as well to bring everything to effect?
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Masters. No, I do not have existing funds right now to do the work we've talked about. It would be my intent as part of the 23-24 budget process to make that part of the request through that process. That's not to say if there's not approval here, we won't begin work on a process under which we would go out and seek a consultant. And but I would need to carefully manage that process through and into next year with respect to funding, with respect to seeking those funds, unless there is a desire for us to, look at other sources of funding such as reserves, but I wouldn't recommend that. I would recommend that we get started on this right away. We start developing the RFP, we go out there and seek that, and I would bring that funding request forward as part of the 23-24 budget discussion, which council would be deliberating in December, so in 3 months' time. I don't think that will be a big obstacle, but it would be part of, funding discussions as well.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you, Councillor Fundura. Councillor Hawkins?
Thank you, Mayor. To everything, there's a season. And the season right now is to make a decision. We have listened for 2 long days, interesting days, thoughtful days, days full of statistics on fair wage policy. The motion before us is that we should send it back to administration for more research. The administration has already done a very substantial amount of research, and there's not much doubt about what the policy is we've been talking about in general terms. We've been talking about a prescriptive fair wage policy. Classically, one in which a calculation is made of the fair wages, and that calculation is used as part of a procurement process, and if you fail to meet the fair wage, you're disqualified in some way from the procurement process. It's prescriptive. That's what we've been talking about. It reaches down into the organization and management of business by government a long, long way. Councillor Mancinelli put forward an interesting idea. He said, well, maybe we can think about this in a whole different kind of way, in a way that's not a prescriptive fair wage policy, but is rather more like a certification policy or a voluntary policy, one in which the enforcement mechanism would be much different. He may well be right that there are other kinds of policies dealing with the fair wage issue out there. But that's not what's before us tonight. We've understood the kind of fair wage policy that's in front of us. And we've heard statistics, quite frankly, that indicate it's going to be very costly to flesh that out, to develop the policy in its full, to administer the policy, and to enforce the policy. And surely that can't be in any doubt. I would submit to you that tonight we should deal with the issue of that model of fair wage policy that we have been discussing. To refer it back to the administration and ask them to develop a whole panoply of different models of fair wage policy risks us having this debate go on for months and months and months. And I cannot believe that that's what the citizens of Regina want. I cannot believe that that would be good for those supplying this city with goods and services, and I cannot believe it would be good for the workers in those industries. if Councillor Mancinelli has an idea about an alternate policy, I would urge him to pursue it. I would urge him to continue his discussion with industry. I would especially urge him to work with the administration to clarify that, and then to bring it to this council in a form in which we can deal with it. But we can't do that, and we can't accomplish those things, and we just burden the administration endlessly by tying that up in this prescriptive fair wage policy that is before us. So for two reasons, I suggest we get on with it. I'm going to vote no on the fair wage policy prescriptive model that's before us for the reasons that have all been rehearsed before this council. And I know that others disagree with them. But I'm also going to say to Councillor Mancinelli, your idea isn't being dismissed here out of hand by any means, but it's the subject of a conversation for another day if you're ready to bring it here after having worked, I'd suggest, with the administration. So I will be supporting the main motion absent 6, and I will be opposing the fair wage policy motion contained in number 6. Thank you.
Councillor Hawkins. Councillor Bresciani, you want to close off debate?
Nothing further.
Thanks very much. Council will be voting on item recommendations 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 7 right now on response to procurement. Clerk, can I have you put that up?
Through you, Mayor Masters, the motion is carried unanimously.
Thank you very much to the clerks. Clerk, could I have you put up the vote on item number 6?
Through you, Mayor Masters, the motion is carried 6-4 with the following.
Sorry, I hit no, and I didn't even hit anything yet.
It says oh, because you were the mover?
I was the mover, so.
Oh, but you weren't the mover.
Yeah, she was.
Well, I was the mover, but
You voted no?
yeah.
Because you have it as the mover?
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you want to have it? What you spoke against it, sorry, for discussion.
Which is possible, yeah, because it automatically will mark.
Okay, we'll vote manually. Do a roll call, please, Kirk. Vote clerk, sorry about that, Amber.
Through you, Mayor Masters, I will start with Councillor Stanichuk.
In favor.
Councillor Stevens,
In favor.
Councillor Bresciani,
Opposed.
Councillor Mancinelli,
Opposed.
Councillor LeBlanc,
In favor.
Councillor Findera,
Opposed.
Councillor Zakidniak,
In favor.
And Counselor Hawkins?
Opposed.
Counselor Mole?
In favor.
Mayor Masters?
Opposed.
The motion is carried 6-4. 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 6 that said that they were in favor. Who did I mark incorrect then?
Ventura, Bresciani, Mancinelli, Masters, Ventura, and Hawkins against. It's 5-5.
It's 5-5, it's a tie.
Okay, it's lost then. My apologies. It's a tie vote.